as I find the information on it, is this Secretary Russell Redding. So Secretary Redding has quite a background. He's been the 26th Pennsylvania Secretary of Agriculture since May of 2015. He's the former Dean of School of Ag and Environmental Sciences at Delaware Valley University. He's also the past Pennsylvania Secretary of Agriculture during the Rendell administration. And as little known fact, he actually was raised on a dairy farm that was and not only raised on the farm, but he also operated the farm for several years in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And with that, I give you Secretary Russell Redding.
Hey, Pete, good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction, Tim. Thank you as well for stepping into your new role. And Pete, thank you for leading NRCS in Pennsylvania. Very much appreciate that. It's an honor to be with you this morning. Thank you all for taking time to participate in the boot camp. But more importantly, as Pete mentioned, just the opportunity that you have this week, of course, but also in your work and your chosen field of conservation. Every time that I am, able to welcome a class to the boot camp, I'm reminded of the important work that is in your hands, from improving the environment, managing those natural resources, but I also believe enhancing, the quality of life in Pennsylvania is found in your hands in the work of conservation. So thank you for what you do. I also want to express my appreciation to NRCS and PACD and the State Conservation Commission and all of those partners that, Pete mentioned that are either part of today's event or this week's event, but also the partnerships that take to get conservation on the ground in Pennsylvania. I have seen the power of your work and the work of conservation district technicians on my own farm. We are lucky enough to have a farm in Pennsylvania. Some of you have heard my story, but every time that I step out the door here to look at the farm, I am reminded of the many, many years of work that NRCS, the Conservation District here in Adams County, has put into working with my father-in-law and other farms in this community to make this farm sort of what it is today. It is completely transformed from what it was in the 1950s and 60s to where it is today, both in terms of its landscape, but its benefits to the environment, both in conservation, water quality, wildlife management, pollination, all of those things that we spend a lot of time talking about. So I've seen that firsthand. I know the important work that's being done. We could not do in the departments what we need to do. We are one of those regulatory agencies that oversees agriculture in so many forms, but also on the conservation side as well. But I come back to my father-in-law who spent a lifetime here on the farm, farming and improving it. And I tell the story often of in the final days of his life. I asked him what he was most proud of, and his response to this day reminds me of the work that we do and you do, but also my charge and mission as a secretary, but also as a farmer. What he said was the conservation and preservation of his farm, and there's not a better reminder of our work, but also a better legacy. So that is not just for him. It is a reflection of the family's work and all of those who helped him do that. So how do we do this? I mean, I think it's done clearly in a full systems approach where we recognize the long-standing conservation, deep culture of conservation stewardship that our farm community has. We have to expect good conservation planning and implementation, but we also have to expect that our farm and farmers are going to manage those resources they're entrusted with. And we have to always recognize that agriculture is a business. It's a business without walls, but every bit of business. So it's complicated work. It takes a lot of science. It takes a lot of civics, because what you do is to translate what you're going to hear today around the basic biology and the sciences and, and put that into practice. And I think that is really a critical role for all of us. One final point, just on climate. We spent a lot of time talking about climate. It's going to be, part of our, policy work, is part of our policy work and program work. All of you know that, agriculture's got an intimate relationship with the climate. It poses great risk for us given that relationship, and it certainly is something that we want to, work together on. We're on the front lines in agriculture of the negative impacts of climate, but we're also in the front lines and the first wave of solutions for conservation and climate here in Pennsylvania. The collective work, I think, of making sure that agriculture takes full advantage of those practices that we've invested in. They are the foundation of climate resiliency, whether it's preservation and conservation and nutrient management and soil health. All of that, I think, is part of the story of climate. And final would be just on climate is that not to look at it, each of you and young in your profession and work in conservation, but I say this to all, that we can't look at climate simply in one dimension. It is making sure that we look at climate and food production, climate and health, climate and rural development, and climate and conservation, and climate and research, and make your list. My point is that it's not about just the climate. It's the practices that we apply. It's the policy work that we do. It's the intersection of where climate meets, the rest of our lives. And that is certainly in our food system and in our natural environment. So important to be part of that. But the work of climate is predicated on the work of conservation. We're in the business of managing carbon. That's what we do in agriculture. So I'm just excited to be part of that. I'm excited to always be with you. I do look forward, as Pete notes, to that day when we're back together, when I can see you, I can hear the introductions, which is always a highlight for me to see who is in this business and where you work, what you do. But please, thank you, and enjoy the week. I look forward to working with you in the years to come. Thank you. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Secretary Redding. And I'm glad you brought up the environmental stuff. With the new administration, definitely agriculture can be in the mix for greenhouse gas reduction, and NRCS as an agency is certainly in the mix of formulating new policy and guidance. But I do believe that what we've done in the conservation world in dust reduction and saving fuel, less trips in the field, more cover, carbon sequestration, all those things, we're doing that now. We're going to maybe take more credit for that thing, but certainly there's going to be some new programs rolled up by NRCS to really target some of the conservation stuff we do in that zone.
Pete, I think we lost your audio.
I see that. Sorry about that. Okay.
Oh, you're back.
Thank you. Russell, a great presentation on that. And the one thing I wanted to say about for NRCS's point of view is with the new administration coming in, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and all those kind of things is definitely in our mindset to be resolved here in the near future. And our agency as an agency is going to
Pete, you cut out again. I don't know if it's your headphones.
Yeah, I don't know why it keeps doing that. Sorry about that. I won't repeat what I had, but greenhouse gas is an important thing for NRCS, and we're developing new policy on that kind of stuff, and we'll be working in that general direction. But just remember that what we're doing already is working in the right direction for that kind of stuff. So our last speaker here is Carl Brown. He's the Executive Secretary of the State Conservation Commission. He's been the director of that commission since 1995. He's responsible for multiple programs, nutrient management, dirt and gravel road, oversight, implementation of some of the PA Farm Bill stuff, the REAP program, the pilot for excellent grants, land grant program, a whole bunch of different programs that the state puts on with Russell Redding's support to really help agriculture. Prior to that, from 1984 to 1995, he worked with the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau Governmental Relations Division. And here's his link, 1982 to 84, he worked as a soil conservationist with the Lebanon Conservation District. So he's a former conservation district person. 80 to 82, he worked on as a lab technician and research field crew for PSU Plant Nutrition, and is a Penn State grad. And without further ado, Mr. Carl Brown.
Good morning, Pete. Good morning, Secretary Redding. It's hard to believe we've been doing this now for 20 years, and just want to make sure we say thank you to NRCS, because without NRCS, this boot camp and the training that we are participants in couldn't happen. So truly appreciate NRCS and all the folks that put time and energy into this training opportunity, and it's unique. Started 20 years ago in Pennsylvania, and it's been replicated in other places. So you've probably heard the word partnership at least a half a dozen times this morning already in the first 15 minutes. And it's exciting to see 50 different people from conservation districts and NRCS and Pheasants Forever and DEP and others. So that concept of partnership and the partnership we have in training is really important in Pennsylvania's conservation. So it's exciting to be here this morning. Just a couple of quick things. One is this training, as Pete has mentioned, is really important to you, because this will be the building blocks for whatever you're doing, whether you're with NRCS or the district or anyone else. These are really some of the most basic building blocks that you'll be talking about here in the next couple of days. So they're really important to you, and I encourage you to engage and to take the opportunity to really dig into this training. So it's important to you. It's important to our Commonwealth as we look at the non-point source challenges that we have, both in agriculture and other places. If we're going to meet our goals of our WIP and our local plans, it's really important to the Commonwealth that we have good folks that are out there, well-trained, to be able to assist farmers. But really what's most important is, if we're going to be successful in conservation, we need to be able to educate and convince and assist landowners in making changes that they need to make on their operations. So without their willingness to adapt and to implement these practices, we will not be successful. So most important is the ability to have the skills and the knowledge to be able to help farmers and landowners make changes and to make improvements on their operations. Just want to say, and I think I've said this for the last 20 years, the trainers that are going to present to you this morning and the rest of this week are professional conservationists first and trainers second. So they work to be able to present this information in the best formats they can, but be patient with them at times. If they're like me, they're old dogs learning new tricks, especially with technology. So for those more seasoned folks that are trying to find the mute button and how to make this technology work, just be patient with them. But they're a great group of trainers. They have a lot of expertise, hundreds of years of experience in the field that you're going to be studying. Lastly, just wanted to encourage you, while there's some great trainers, I encourage you, and this is a little bit more difficult in a virtual environment, but learn from each other. There's a lot of people on this training this week, 50 some people. They will come to the table with expertise that's unique to them, whether it be a lifetime of working with beef cattle or on a farm, or working with horses, or whatever their expertise may be. There's a lot of folks that are sitting around the table that are learning with you that are going to have some great skills and some great knowledge. And they're going to be your coworkers in the future. So as you learn from your instructors, also learn from your other participants. Get the opportunity to learn from them, to get to know them, get to know what expertise they have, because there may be a day in the future where you pick up the phone, call one of the folks that's being trained with you, to be able to get some help in a particular area. So I encourage you to learn from each other. And most importantly, I encourage you to enjoy the week. This virtual format's new and it's different. And I know that there's some in-person training coming in the late summer, early fall, but mostly enjoy the opportunity that you have this week, and make as much of it as you can. And just again, thank you to NRCS for their willingness to be the lead trainers on this. And I'll turn it back to Pete.
Hey, thank you, Carl. And I guess Carl made a good point. I hit the mute button twice, and technology is always a challenge. I think I'm going to ask Tim, do we share who's the attendees with the attendees on this, Tim?
We haven't shared the attendance list. We can do that.
We should probably clean it up a little bit, keep PII stuff out of it, but we should probably give everybody a list of who the attendees are, since we kind of this virtual world here. So if they see somebody on the list, they know they attended the course together, maybe they can get together that way. So that might be a good, like Carl's idea, a little cross link there with, so the students have a better idea who's in the class with. They might see their initials, but not know who they are. So I think we should do that. Hey, and with that, Tim, I think we're done with the introductions, and we're going to pass it back to Tim, and have a fun week, everybody in the class. A lot of interesting things. This originally was called Engineering Boot Camp, so there's a lot of engineering slant. We have many hours on hydrology, and we have biology and map units and quality assurance, construction materials. So you're going to get a lot of different exposure to different things, and absorb as much as you can. And with that, Tim, I'm going to pass it back to you, and folks, have a great week.
Excellent. Thank you. Big thanks to Secretary Redding, Pete Vanderstappen, and Carl Brown. I certainly appreciate that they prioritized this training and took time out of their busy schedules to welcome everyone to the course today. So big thanks to them, and great idea from Pete to get a participant list out to all of you. There, we will provide to the in-person course in the late summer, but we'll get you a list. I'll send that out this evening, so you should have that for tomorrow morning, who all is on this course, where they are from, and then a contact for each person. But we'll take some of the information that you don't need out of that participant list. So very good. With that, we're going to dive right into the presentations. Our first presentation comes from Dan Ludwig. Dan is our NRCS State Resource Conservationist, and he's fairly new to that position, but Dan seems to do a little bit of everything. He's involved in all sorts of stuff at NRCS, and I will say he jumped into this presentation a little last second, so we had to shuffle some presenters around a little bit. So big thanks to Dan for taking over this part of the course. So Dan, with that, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Tim. So greetings, everyone. I did a brief scan through the list here of participants this morning, and looks like a lot of you I ended up meeting this past fall when we did the Introduction to Conservation Planning training in Lebanon. So good to see a lot of familiar faces, and it's also good to see a lot of new names here. Then I look forward to working with you in the future. As Tim had said, I am now serving as the State Resource Conservationist here in Harrisburg. Prior to joining this position, I was the Regional Grazing Specialist out of the Lebanon Tech Center for the Southeast area. So I've done a lot of work in the area, a lot of work within the agency over time. But one thing we're going to talk about today to get things started is the federal laws and regulations that deal with conservation planning. I just want to echo, as Pete pointed out, for NRCS, we are a non-regulatory agency, so it's strictly voluntary for a producer to work with us. So we have all of our laws and regulations that I'm going to talk about this morning relate to conservation planning and the different laws and regulations that we have to follow as conservation planners. So with that, hit the wrong button. Let's make sure I can advance the slide here. See, technology's wonderful when it works. There we go. So our objectives this morning is, I want you to get a brief understanding of compliance requirements when you're providing NRCS assistance or working under the umbrella of NRCS. And also, understand the roles and responsibilities of NRCS, its partners, and farmers in addressing our compliance responsibility. So again, this is not state regulatory compliance. This is compliance with the regulations and laws that we have to follow as conservation planners. Just get started this morning with some brief definitions, because I've been to a lot of trainings myself, and even when it comes to wetlands, our cadres are always going over, do you remember how things work in the legislative branch? So it's always good to provide this as a refresher, but laws are those written by the legislative branch, and they're approved by the executive branch and establish the authority for government action. So those are things that we have to follow that are written by those legislatures. Regulations is the next step down, and these are written by agencies that provide clarification to the public necessary for the implementation of a law. So again, we have the law, and then we have regulations, which are kind of that support information, not really an interpretation, but basically instructions. Think of it as instructions on how to follow those laws. And then our policies are again written by agencies, and they provide internal guidance on how each agency is going to implement those laws and regulations. So kind of go through that because things are policy. Our agencies have policies that tie to law. So again, policies tell us how our agency is going to work within those laws and regulations. So look at a little bit about NRCS policy. Essentially, we're helping our clients, whether it's a farmer, a landowner, a producer. It helps us plan and apply conservation practices that are in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So when we're doing our conservation practices, we have to make sure that we are not causing long-term negative impacts, and also that they fall within the laws and regulations. So kind of one of the main practices that we do that I can really relate to is think about a stream crossing. Stream crossings for livestock trails are very important. One, for what they do for protecting the natural resources. However, there are laws and regulations that protect that stream. So again, we're going to plan a conservation practice, but we have to fall within the laws and regulations through DEP to implement that practice. So that gets into the second bullet too. So we have to comply with those laws and regulations, but there's also different executive orders and policies that we must adhere to when we're doing our conservation planning. So, and they're pointed out here in the bullets. So a lot of you that came to intro to planning, we use the acronym a lot, NEPA. So that's our National Environmental Policy Act. So that tells us that we have to look at all the different laws and regulations, so such as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. We have to make sure that our practices and our planning take into account endangered species, cultural resources. So those are all acts that we have to follow and make sure that we do our due diligence in doing documentation or potentially consultation with some of these agencies. So when it comes to the National Endangered Species Act, in the Southeast and maybe up in the Northeast, we have bog turtles. They're a federally listed species, and we do our PNDI hits. And so when we're doing our planning, we cannot negatively impact those habitats. So that's where we're required to do consultation with both state and federal agencies that have jurisdiction over that. So those are some of the big acts that we follow. The other thing is the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. So again, when we're working with producers, there's a lot of PII. So, if you're not familiar with PII, personally identifiable information. So all of that information has to be kept safely in our hands. We cannot share that with outside organizations, even though we might have to consult with another agency about a conservation practice. We still cannot just freely give out that information. We are bound by regulations that say we have to protect that information. And then we also have other executive orders and related NRCS policy. Now, we could probably spend all day talking about policy, but we've got better things to learn about on a Monday morning than policy. But so as you get working through your career and working with experienced planners, you're going to find that there's a lot of considerations out there, but it's easy navigable when once you get that experience. It'll become secondhand. It's like riding a bike. Once you learn about the different agencies, the different laws that we must follow, it does not become overwhelming. It may seem overwhelming at first, but again, as we work through this, it becomes second nature. So who is responsible for compliance? Well, it's a shared responsibility. So, as I mentioned with the stream crossing example, our landowners or operators are responsible for compliance with all the state, federal, local laws, rules, and regulations. So yes, even though we may be planning that stream crossing, they're still required, the landowner or the participant is still required to obtain that permit from DEP or any of the other regulatory agencies. So, and that comes to our second bullet here, that NRCS employees are not to assume the responsibility for obtaining those permits, rights, or approvals, or for we're, like we said, we don't enforce. We're not an enforcement agency, so so we cannot force farmers to comply with different regulations that you're going to learn about later after I finish up this morning. Our goal here is to work with those landowners and producers to help them implement practices and work within those laws and regulations. But so again, going back to that stream crossing permit, it's not NRCS's responsibility to obtain that permit for the producer, but we provide that assistance for that producer to gain that permit. And there's, between NRCS and, because we do have partner employees with us today, there may be some different responsibilities that you may have to fall under based on the agency that you work for. So again, compliance is a shared responsibility between us and the producer or our client. So, question that sometimes comes up is, do NRCS policies apply to partners? So our contributing partners must adhere to our NRCS Field Office Technical Guide and related policies. So, so we do have that shared. Lost my train of thought. Our MOU, I'm trying not to talk in alphabet soup this morning, so our memorandum of understanding. So most of the conservation districts have that with NRCS. So when you're working under that, or if you're an affiliate, so there's some shared funding between NRCS and your agency, you are considered to be working on behalf of NRCS. So yes, you have to follow the NRCS policies and regulations. So the Field Office Technical Guide is available on the internet, so if you haven't been there yet, but that's our repository for all the different information that you need throughout the planning process. So we've got our practice standards there. We've got a whole lot of different information broken up into those 5 different sections. But again, everything that you need to know is contained in that. Plus, we have our NRCS website that has a lot of good information, as well as if you have access to our SharePoint, we put a lot of information that you need as planners there as well. So what are your responsibilities? You're working for NRCS, you're working for the district, you've got this great job, helping farmers put conservation on the ground. So our responsibilities are to recognize which practices are subject to applicable laws and regulations. So not every practice that we do is subject to it, but obviously think about those practices that have the greatest impacts to the different, streams, wildlife, that. Also, our responsibility is to provide the landowner or our operators with contact information. So if they do need that permit for a stream crossing, because we plan that practice, we need to be providing that information so they know where to go to obtain that permit. One of the biggest things that we do is providing those maps. Every participant, landowner, client likes to have a map of where we're doing these different practices, technical data. So how do we implement those practices? So we're doing cover crop. We provide those implementation requirements so they know what to actually seed. And also from our engineering side of things, we're doing our designs and construction plans and specs, and that's all planned out during the planning process. So those of you that have been to Intro to Planning, remember there's those 9 steps of conservation planning. And as we work through that, we provide information that's developed as we work through those 9 steps. And then also we provide that additional technical assistance only after those landowners have obtained those permits. So yes, we may do the design for the stream crossing. We know that it's doing good things for water quality and protecting natural resources. But again, until that producer obtains that permit, we cannot provide that technical assistance because again, we need to make sure that the landowner or our client is following the rules and regulations set forth by our other partner agencies. So again, just because we know that it's needed, sometimes there's a delay in the permitting process. We just have to hold on and wait for that permit before we start providing that technical assistance. Okay, so how does NRCS comply with laws and regulations? So again, those of you that have been to Intro to Planning, we spent some time going over the environmental evaluation worksheet, otherwise known as the CPA 52. And that's what allows us to document everything that we've looked at and we're complying with the NEPA Act. So, and again, it's broken, our 52 is broken up into different sections. We have our NRCS resource concerns, typically has that acronym SWAPA plus H&E. And then below that are our special environmental concerns. And that's really what the nuts and bolts of NEPA is looking at all the different things that are subject to federal and state regulations. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but again, I had mentioned some: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, T&E species. But you can see if you haven't worked through a 52, these are all those down in that section. But again, it's all stuff that we have to evaluate. We have to document our actions and provide consultation and follow-up with federal agencies or state agencies if our planned actions could have a negative impact to anything on that list. Okay, so FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act, again, yes, there are times where outside agencies can request the information, but and we're not going to go into that, but again, we have the responsibility of protecting that information. But again, the Freedom of Information Act generally provides any person, court enforceable right to access a federal agency record, except when those portions of those records are protected. So again, the Privacy Act of 1974 was enacted to protect individuals from unwarranted invasions. So basically, a conservation plan is a protected source of information. So, in addition to, name, address, location, it may seem harmless to share with an agency the conservation practices that are going on the farm, where they're actually located. But, under the Privacy Act of 1974, we are responsible for protecting that information unless the producer grants us the ability to share that information. So even some days you might get a call from a neighbor that's concerned with going on with the farm next door. It may say, oh, well, yeah, no problem. Joe he's doing this practice. We have to think about that. That's information that, even though it seems like a good thing that we want to share, that is information that we have to protect and really shouldn't be giving out without the permission of that landowner or the owner of that conservation plan. So, just don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to, point out that, sometimes what we think is just harmless sharing of information, you really got to think about, what we're sharing and what we're sharing to who and what they're going to do with that information. Because if we share information and then somebody uses it in let's say a bad way, then we can be held responsible for sharing that information. Which gets us into the next section that, section 1619. Some of you may have heard this. We throw it around a lot. We say, oh, well, we have to look at 1619. Well, this is section 1619 of the 2008 Farm Bill. And that gives us pretty good information on what we can and cannot share. So, any employee or contractor or partner employee will not disclose this information. So pretty much I've talked about that. So again, their operation, their practices, the land itself, we cannot share any information. If they get an EQIP contract or an RCPP contract, we cannot share those details without permission from that landowner, or even geospatial information. Sometimes we make maps. We figure, oh, well, we're going to share this map to show where things are going. Again, that's all geospatial information. And that has to be, again, we have to hold that information in our files unless we have that written consent from the producer to share that information. Okay, so, again, most of our NRCS and Conservation District offices are co-located with each other. We work back and forth all the time. But again, we have that memorandum of understanding that says, yes, we can use those files back and forth to write conservation plans. But again, depending on what that information is going to be used for, that's where we have to think about, do we need this release of records? So, if our records are going to be used for enforcement of something because of a state law or regulation, again, we cannot release that information unless we have written consent from that individual who owns those records. And that's where the release of records form comes in. We have a standard form that's available for you to use. I think in your binder, we have some copies, example copy, simple form. We can put on there the landowner can be specific to what pieces of information they want to share. They can even put dates of what time frame they can share it. It's not always an indefinite. If they only want to have their information shared with an agency for 3 months, they can specify that. So again, we have to talk to our producers, make sure they understand that we're holding their information safely, and we're not going to share that without their written consent. So with that, kind of breeze through it, but kind of get us back on track this morning. It's not always the greatest subject to hear about first thing on a Monday morning after we had a nice beginning of the weekend, not so much after the rain. But with that, does anybody have any questions on this portion of laws and regulations that we follow as NRCS or partner employees?
No questions in the chat, Dan. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. And Dan, we'll look forward to hearing more from you tomorrow morning.
You betcha. I'll try to be this chipper and shining.
I would expect nothing less. Thanks, Dan.
You bet.
All right. So with that, we're going to move on to our next presentation. Big thanks to Dan. But our next presenters are going to be a tag team. John Berger from the State Conservation Commission, and I'll just put a mention for John that he also plays a big role in all of the planning for the Boot Camp Basic course. So big thanks to John there. And John's partner is going to be Kate Bresaw from DEP, who focuses on the ag side of things at DEP. So John and Kate, it's all yours. And I'm going to share the slides. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I can see that.
Very good. Well, if you just want to let me know when you want slides progressed, then I will do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, you can move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As Tim had introduced me, I'm with the State Conservation Commission, have been working with the State Conservation Commission well over 25 years. I started my career in conservation and working with conservation districts back at the Lebanon County Conservation District, and moved into DEP for several years in the Chesapeake Bay program, and moved on to the State Conservation Commission and have been working in various programs that are related to the Act 38 Nutrient Management Program that we'll be talking about here in a few minutes, and other programs that are with the Conservation District. The presentation that myself and Kate Bresaw from DEP will be focusing on this morning is to introduce to you how any state regulatory regulations or any particular laws may have an impact on your interaction and the projects you will be working with ag producers here in the future. So we just wanted to try to not only, like as Dan has introduced you to how some of the federal laws apply to your interaction and working with producers on their projects. Kate and I will take a look at the laws and regulations at the state level that will have that impact. As you can see on the slide in front of you, we're going to probably kind of orient this towards a conservation partnership. As you can see, the entities identified on this slide for many, many years have been functioning in a conservation partnership setting. The State Conservation Commission, USDA NRCS, Pennsylvania's Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Environmental Protection, Penn State Extension, and PACD. So I'll just spend a few moments going over the roles of those entities and how they are working together in developing statewide programs and working with county conservation districts. So if you can move to the next slide, please, Tim. Our conservation partnership basically, are comprised of state and federal agencies and Penn State Extension and PACD. And we're here for a common goal. Our common goal is assisting agricultural producers and operators developing and implementing resource management plans for compliance with state and federal environmental regulations, and to assist that landowner to meeting those requirements within resource management programs. Anything from our Chapter 91 manure management planning to the Ag E&S 102 planning to nutrient management, etc. And as I mentioned before, those are the entities listed there that are part of this whole conservation partnership, and work together in making sure that state and federal and local programs are working in tandem with each other, that they're not, that these programs aren't being implemented and moving in separate location, separate directions. Next slide, please. Just to kind of spend a little time reviewing the role of each one of our conservation partners. NRCS, as you'll experience over the next couple days, provides the technical assistance for plan development and implementation, and that's generally conservation plans, Ag E&S plans, and some nutrient management plans and manure management plans. They basically guide the producer to the other partners or the organizations When we start talking about financial assistance for BMP implementation under a conservation plan or even an Ag E&S plan, etc., they will help guide the producer to the conservation district, to the state conservation commissioner, or other organizations where we can that have some other elements that will help assist the farmer in the implementation of their particular resource management plan. The conservation district, which many of you are working for in our group here, they assist the producer in meeting those regulatory and program obligations and requirements. They kind of help guide the ag producer through all the steps they need to. That may first be the development of a plan, which may involve NRCS, or it may involve the private sector in development of the plan. And so they'll ensure that the producer understands if there's a regulatory program the producer needs to adhere to, these are the steps and these are the elements that they need to be moving through in order to get their proper resource management plan and move towards regulatory compliance. They'll refer to the appropriate technical provider. NRCS is by default in many of our programs the technical provider, but sometimes it does move out into the private sector. And there's also working with the producer in the application of process for permits and financial assistance. When you're looking at some of these programs, permits may be necessary for particular activities, i.e. particularly around stream areas and riparian areas. So there's some DEP permits that have to be secured in order for the project to progress. And then obviously working with the producer to find financial assistance is necessary where those financial assistance programs are available. Our PADEP partner, they basically are involved in program development, developing the guidance for the state level programs that may have regulatory elements to them. If there's permits for respective programs, for example, general permits for stream activities around a stream, there'll be permit review. Kate Bresaw will talk a little bit more this morning about our CAFO program. There's definitely permit review associated with the CAFO program. Kate will speak to that. And then in certain instances where there are regulatory parameters that need to be followed, if those parameters aren't followed by the ag producer, there is enforcement actions that are usually taken by the state by Department of Environmental Protection, depending on the program. And then finally, the State Conservation Commission, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and Penn State Extension. Once again, they're involved in program development, developing policy and guidance, and education and support. We look heavily to Penn State Cooperative Extension for education and support. They have been the practical and very professional organization that we look to for a variety of education and support in a lot of in the ag sector, in manure management, nutrient management, and other elements that are involved that we look to in regards to technical assistance and programs that are implemented by conservation districts for the ag producer. So those are basically the conservation partnership roles. Next slide, please, Tim. To give you a little bit of a broad brush of the agricultural community that the conservation partnership works in, and definitely conservation district and NRCS staff work in. In Pennsylvania, we basically have three groups of agricultural operations in Pennsylvania. We have the animal operations, which through NASS Ag Statistics, there's over 23,000 animal operations in Pennsylvania. Those particular operations need to apply manure or agricultural process wastewater appropriately through a manure management plan, which is the standards have been developed by DEP. Kate will spend a little bit more time on some more details on manure management plans and the manure management manual, but that is first and foremost the largest group that there is some regulatory emphasis that does influence how an agricultural operation works in Pennsylvania. Our next subgroup under that is our concentrated animal operations. Those are basically any particular animal operation that has a density that's greater than 2,000 pounds of live animal weight per acre. This is our Act 38 nutrient management program. This particular category was created and defined under the original Act 6 back in the early 90s, and it was recent, and back in the 2000s was legislatively revised and is now known as Act 38. The Pennsylvania State Conservation Commission administers and enforces the Act 38 program. And under that particular program, that operator will need an approved nutrient management plan, which can be developed by a certified planner. And also, just so you're aware, that particular plan is publicly accessible. So it's one point it did make about animal operations. The manure management plan doesn't have to be developed by a particular planner. It may be developed by the landowner himself, and Kate may speak to that here in a few minutes. And again, those manure management plans are also accessible to the public because it's a public document using public standards and criteria. And then finally, our smallest subgroup of animal operations are the concentrated animal feeding operations. Those are basically based on animal numbers or animal densities, usually over 1,000 animal equivalent units is a typical CAFO. If it's a concentrated animal operation as defined by Act 38, it may be greater than 300 animal equivalent units. So as you move through your trainings that you may be participating here in the next couple months or have participated in particular Act 38 trainings or other trainings, you'll get some of the intricacies of how the regulatory community is defined and how they're categorized. But just to give you an idea, wanted to go over these three major groups in Pennsylvania. CAFOs that's a program that's implemented on behalf of US EPA by DEP. Just about every state in the United States probably has some form of a CAFO program because it is a federal program, but it's implemented at the state level by the respective environmental protection agencies in respective states. For us, it's DEP. So in this case, approved Act 38 nutrient management plans and possibly permits may be necessary for a CAFO. All right, moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Tim. Now we're going to get into some conversations about particular laws and regulations at the state level. This is where I'll hand the baton over to Kate here in a minute here so she can start her discussion. Basically, this is a listing of a lot of the state laws and even some local laws that may impact your ag producers' program implementation on their farm. So we'll go through each one of these here over the course of the next half an hour, and at the end of that, we'll take some opportunity for questions. So I will pass the conversation to Kate.
And you can go to the next slide there, Tim. So good morning, everybody. I'm Kate Breesaw. I'm with DEP. I am the group leader of the Ag Compliance section in the Chesapeake Bay office, though we are a statewide section. We handle all statewide ag programs under the jurisdiction of DEP. Right now we're a section of 2, so you might be dealing with me, or you might be dealing with Megan Porta. She's a water program specialist in the Ag Compliance section. We are expanding, so stay tuned for for new staff that you might run into if you have any questions, concerns, or anything related to ag compliance and DEP. But with that, let's just go ahead and dive in. Federal Clean Water Act. You can go ahead and hit the next slide, Tim. So before we dive in, a bit of a disclaimer that I am going to throw a bunch of legalese at you here in the next couple of slides, but bear with me and feel free to ask any clarifying questions, throw them into the chat, and I will do my very best to answer them for you. For some of our programs, our legal authority is derived from the Clean Water Act, and this was enacted in 1972. It made it unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source to navigable waters unless there is a permit obtained. And EPA's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, that you might hear us say in relation to the NPDES program. That permit program controls those discharges. And animal feeding operations, or AFOs, as John had mentioned, that meet the regulatory definition of a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO, are regulated under NPDES permitting. And these farms that are, as John had mentioned, are farms that are over 1,000 AEUs, they're CAOs that are over 300 AEUs, or it's a farm that meets or exceeds EPA's headcount numbers by animal type. So 700 dairy cows, 1,000 cattle, 55,000 turkeys, stuff like that. And the NPDES permitting and inspection authority is delegated to DEP from EPA. This includes CAFOs, but it also includes construction stormwater permitting for projects that are greater than or equal to an acre of earth disturbance. So you may run into that as well when you're dealing with new or expanding operations. And next slide, Tim. So let's dive into the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law. Next slide. We also have obligation and authority under the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law, and this was enacted in 1937 and regulates any discharge that may cause or contribute to pollution of waters of the Commonwealth. It also establishes the Commonwealth's authority to protect streams from pollution for the benefit of Pennsylvania citizens and the environment. And this is where you find your Act 38 regs that John had mentioned earlier, but it also relates to erosion and sediment control, polluted runoff. This includes manure, stream obstructions and encroachments, and biosolids. And many of the operations you're going to be working with as you're writing conservation plans, doing some implementation work, are going to need to consider these regulations as part of their management strategies. Go ahead, next slide. So first off, Chapter 102, next slide. Pennsylvania's erosion and sediment control regulations can be found under Chapter 102.4 of the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law. 102.4b relates to construction activities, but are still relevant to ag operations when they are proposing any earth disturbance other than plowing or tilling activities or animal heavy use areas. So again, here, think new or expanding operation, new manure storage, new animal housing, stuff like that. 102.4a is specific to ag activities. This includes any operation with plowable or tillable land. This includes no-till, as well as any operation with animal heavy use areas. And animal heavy use areas, think bare lot, any area where because of animal traffic, grass or dense vegetation cannot be maintained. A barnyard, a feedlot, a loafing area, places like that. But it does not include barn entrances or walkways. It requires that all operations with combined areas greater than or equal to 5,000 square foot of earth disturbance related to ag activities, again, think plowing or tilling, including no-till, animal heavy use areas, have a written Ag E&S plan and BMP implementation to minimize accelerated erosion and sedimentation. Below that 5,000 square foot, the operation still needs to have BMPs in place. The BMPs just don't have to be written down in a written plan. All right, next slide. What should be addressed in an Ag E&S plan? The Ag E&S plan will need to identify and have BMPs that address sheet and rill erosion. It meets T over the rotation, and I'm sure that you're going to learn all about that later. And concentrated flow erosion and erosion from animal heavy use areas as applicable. As long as the NRCS conservation plan addresses these concerns, it can be used to satisfy the Ag E&S planning requirements under Chapter 102. But again, if they're going to be using that plan for compliance purposes, make sure you get that signed release. Now, as a reminder, so back to the previous slide, Tim. Sorry.
No, that was my fault. Sorry.
That's
Okay,
fine.
is that right?
That looks right to me. As a reminder, the purpose of these regulations is to protect waters of the Commonwealth from accelerated erosion and sedimentation. These plans only need to include BMPs that address erosion, but they can include things like waste storage facilities, nutrient management, or other BMPs that would be found in a nutrient management plan or manure management plan or NRCS conservation plan that addresses those nutrient concerns. But these are not required components of an Ag E&S plan to be administratively complete. All right, next slide one. So for more information about Ag E&S, you can go ahead and check out the webpage referenced here at the top of the slide here, or you can check out the Soil Erosion and Sediment Control Manual for Ag Operations, or it's our Ag E&S guidance at the link on this slide. And next slide. Or there is an existing course on the Clean Water Academy open to all who are interested, and it covers the Ag Erosion and Sediment Control Manual and associated regulations. It clarifies what the manual is, what is in the manual, and walks the owners, operators, and plan developers through the process of completing the Ag E&S plan. It is an excellent follow-up to the introduction that we gave you here today. But if you have an existing login to the Clean Water Academy, we recommend you go ahead and sign in so you can track your learning. If you're a conservation district employee without a login to the Clean Water Academy, please touch base with PACD, and it's Nick Yegi who's handling it there. Because there will certainly be other courses that are available to you that you can't access that are not open to the public, and it'll help you through your learning process as you're getting to know your delegated and contracted responsibilities. And if you need the link to the Clean Water Academy course for the Ag E&S manual, just let me know and I can throw that into the box. This particular course you do not need to log in for this particular course because we wanted to target the landowners that and special commercial specialists as well. All right, next slide. So let's change direction here into chapter 105. Next slide. And you'll find the regulations related to water obstructions and encroachments in chapter 105 in the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law. The objective of these regulations are to prevent unreasonable interference with water flow from in-stream construction activities. I included these here because if you're working with operations to implement their plans, at stream crossing, for example, you will likely run into scenarios when a 105 general permit will be necessary. Most stream and water body wetland encroachment activities require a permit. Many activities can qualify under a simple general permit. That's these general permits. And these are for projects that are small in scope with simple design. The permit provisions are pre-approved by Pennsylvania DEP, but federal regulations may apply to larger projects. An important message here is just plan ahead. These GPs, the GP applications can take several days for approval. And there is a 10-day notification to PA Fish and Boat Commission before construction activities. All right, next slide. GPs are DEP approved permits, as I had mentioned earlier, where the applicant registers to utilize that permit. And again, they're for projects small in scope. And the use of a GP may be waived in some circumstances. And the Pennsylvania Code Title 25, this is 105.12, if you're looking for it, details waivers. The activity is still regulated, but Chapter 105 permit waiver may be issued by DEP, and you would submit an inquiry to DEP for permission for a waiver. The waiver may not be issued if DEP determines that the project may have significant impacts to the project area or the environment. Next slide. So some planning considerations here. The producer should have an Ag E&S plan, as we described in the 102 section, if it's applicable, and make sure that you have conversations about the permit and the permitting process with the producer, so they understand that, you know, with this particular practice, you are going to need a permit, so that they understand what they're getting into through the Ag E&S or conservation planning process. All right, next slide. And this list here is just commonly used GPs that may be associated with projects that you're helping to implement as part of your conservation work. And next slide. And these are some of the common BMPs that require GP. So as we had mentioned earlier, stream crossing tops the list, underground outlet, grass waterway, line waterway outlet, stuff like that. All right, next slide. And you can find all of the required forms and documents associated with Chapter 105 general permits at the link on this slide. Please note that construction activities cannot proceed until approval or acknowledgement is received from DEP or a delegated conservation district. Each permit has a specific list of conditions where the general permit does not apply, so make sure you read through that. And the approved permit must be on site during the construction activities. All right, next slide. And for more information about 105, you can go ahead and then follow the breadcrumbs here listed on this slide. Next slide. And then joint permits are for obstructions and encroachments that do not qualify for a waiver or a general permit. And these are generally small projects with insignificant impacts. I'm not going to say much more about joint permits other than there is a joint review by DEP and U.S. Army Corps. And you can find more information about joint permits by following the breadcrumbs. Oh, sorry, it's the next slide. Yeah, there you go. The breadcrumbs on this slide. And if you need more information, go ahead and follow that. All right, go ahead and the next slide then. Yep. So chapter 275 and next slide. The application of biosolids is regulated under Chapter 275 of the Clean Streams Law. Facilities producing biosolids must obtain the permit in order to land apply biosolids, and they must be applied according to a nutrient or manure management plan. There are specific setbacks and management practices associated with the application of biosolids, and we have, for more information here, you can check out this link on the biosolids program. All right, next slide. And animal operations, and next slide. So this is the animal operations that John had mentioned earlier. All farms or entities in Pennsylvania that land apply manure or agricultural process wastewater must meet some level of state requirements. This is regardless of size. They can be very small, 1 pony, or very large, 125,000 broiler operation. Says regardless of manure origin, it could include operations with livestock or poultry on site, as well as operations that are importing that manure. And this is regardless of application type. This could be mechanically applied or directly applied by the animals on pasture. All right, next slide. And in Pennsylvania, we have 3 main categories, as John had mentioned earlier, when we think about ag operations that are land applying manure. We have CAFOs, which is the smallest in number across the state of Pennsylvania, approximately 450 plus. And like I said earlier, these are operations that are greater than or 1,000 AEUs, or CAOs that are greater than 300 AEUs, or operations that meet or exceed EPA's headcount numbers. And these are regulated by DEP as delegated by EPA. And these operations need an approved Act 38 nutrient management plan, DEP CAFO permit that is publicly posted for 30 days, and an Ag E&S plan on all applicable acres. Next on the list there is CIOs. So these are operations with greater than 2,000 pounds of livestock or poultry per acres of land suitable for nutrient application. So these are regulated by the SEC, and they need an Act 38 nutrient management plan and an Ag E&S plan on all applicable acres. And then we have our animal operations, and these are all other operations that are land applying manure or ag process wastewater. These are regulated by DEP and need a manure management plan and an Ag E&S plan on all applicable acres. All right, next slide. So you don't have to remember all of that off the top of your head if you're assisting the ag operator. This flow chart explains it very well, and it's just one to keep hanging on your wall at your office or nearby, so you can, and it can be found in the link on this slide. All right, next slide. Let's dive into Chapter 91 a little bit here. Next slide. All right, good. Chapter 91.36A covers the design and construction criteria of manure storages. And the main points here are the manure storage should be constructed to prevent pollution of surface and groundwater, including design to prevent discharges during at least the 25-year, 24-hour storm. And if constructed to meet the current standards of the PA Tech Guide, it meets that requirement. And there's also a requirement for liquid and semi-solid manure storages that were constructed after January of 2000 to be certified by a professional engineer. And there's also free board requirements. Chapter 91.36B says these operations that land apply animal manure or ag process wastewater. This is ag process wastewater is things like milk house water, egg wash water, etc. And they must implement that written manure management plan in accordance with the manure management manual. And this is regardless of if that manure is mechanically applied or directly applied by livestock or poultry. And CAOs are regulated under Act 38 and CAFOs under 92.5A, but we'll get into that here a little later. The manure management manual can be found on this slide as well, the link on this slide. All right, next slide. Getting a little lost here. So the manure management plan within the manure management manual, it must be a written plan. And it can be developed by the farmer or other non-certified individual. It must be it must use the standard format and worksheets in the manure management manual unless there's an alternative that is approved by DEP. And the plans don't need to be submitted for approval, but they must be available on site as to view by DEP or delegated conservation district staff upon request. And it includes more information than just manure application rates. It includes manure manual application setbacks, winter manure application, manure storage and stacking requirements, pasture management, animal concentration areas management, and records are required to document implementation, and they must be kept on farm as well. So to assist in the completeness determination for a manure management plan, you can check out the link on the slide for our administratively completeness review guide. All right, next slide. And there are a couple places you can look for more information on manure management. There's the Nutrient Management Manure Management Program website that's administered by Penn State Extension. And there's also our manure management website on the DEP site, and you can get there by following the links on this slide. All right, next slide. So Chapter 92A, these are our CAFO regulations, and this flow chart is a quick and easy reference citing EPA's headcount numbers that I've been mentioning throughout the whole presentation here, and all other conditions that would make an operation a CAFO. This is also a really nice one to keep hanging on your wall, and you can find it here on the link on this slide. Next one. Again, CAFOs are regulated by DEP as delegated by EPA, and we have over 450 CAFOs in Pennsylvania. Each of these requires an MPDS permit from DEP. This can be an individual or general permit depending on the conditions of the operation. The permit is reviewed by DEP. It's publicly noticed for 30 days. And there are additional requirements for manure storages, record keeping, and reporting for CAFOs. These operations need an Act 38 nutrient management plan that is reviewed or approved by the County Conservation District or the SCC, and an Ag ENS plan on all applicable acres. So DEP inspects these operations at least once every 5 years, and the SCC or the County Conservation District conducts status reviews on these operations annually. All right, next slide. This is another great flow chart to keep on the wall. It demonstrates a water quality management permit and when it would be needed. And it can be found here on this link. All right, next slide. In short, water quality management permits are required on new, expanded, liquid, or semi-solid manure storages constructed after January 29th, 2000 on operations with over 1,000 AEUs. Where the storage is between 1 million and 2.5 million gallons capacity, and the storage is a pond that meet one of these two requirements. It's the special protection watershed or watershed impaired from nutrients by ag sources. And on all liquid or semi-solid storages greater than 2.5 million gallons. Also of note, as of 2000, all newly built liquid and semi-solid manure storages must be designed by Pennsylvania Registered Professional Engineer, and construction must be signed off by an engineer or certification kept on site. And the individual permit applies to special protection waters, and the general permit applies to existing, new CAOs, not in special protection waters. All right, next slide. If you want more information on CAFOs, go ahead and take a look at the breadcrumb on this slide. And this is where John will take off, and then I believe, and then the next slide.
I like how you characterize the web links as the breadcrumbs. That's kind of a unique way of putting it. So moving on to our list of regulatory programs that the ag producers you are working with may need to satisfy. Act 38 of 2005, that's our Nutrient Management Act program. And Tim, you can move on to the next slide if you would, please. The objective of the Act 38 Nutrient Management Program is basically the essential preservation of water quality in Pennsylvania. The Act itself creates some nutrient management planning standards, which are the regulations. If some of you have gone through or are currently going through our nutrient management certification cycle, you will have significant exposure to the planning standards in the regulatory document that was created for the Act 38 program. Once again, those planning standards have focus on concentrating animal operations, but they are also applicable to volunteer animal operations who wish to develop a nutrient management plan that meets the Act 38 standards. So you'll learn more about that as you go through the certification program. CAOs are required to develop a nutrient management plan or balance sheets following the standards and the regulations, and this particular program is administered by the State Conservation Commission. But we do involve conservation districts in the administration and implementation of the program simply through the review of nutrient management plans and approval of nutrient management plans at the local level. The commission would not be able to review and approve all the plans that are developed and implemented through the course of the program. I think we have well over 1,000 CAOs right now over the past 20 years. So this is administered at the local level on behalf of the State Conservation Commission. Next slide, please, Tim. The nutrient management plan and the nutrient balance sheets are very, very similar in nature. However, the complexity of those two particular documents under the planning criteria are slightly different. You can see there where a nutrient management plan identifies the nutrient sources on the farm, determines the application rates and how any excess manure is going to be handled, and then also identifies any BMP needs that may be necessary on the farm, whether they are manure management related or they are stormwater related. And this is where I'd like to maybe put a little emphasis on this last bullet here, is that we put a strong emphasis that nutrient management plans developed under the Act 38 program are consistent with conservation plan or Ag E&S plan activities. We don't want a producer to have several different plans that he's using to meet any type of regulatory or programmatic requirement, and they're not consistent and they function differently in separate paths from each other. So something to keep in mind as you are working with other partner agencies in the program and you're working on different products with those agencies. There needs to be conversation between the planners, between the technical service providers, and between the conservation districts who may be advising and shepherding the ag producer through his project, or make sure that all the plans that are necessary that dictate the project or oversee the project that the producer is working on are consistent and they work together, or else they're going to have some problems. Also, nutrient balance sheets are basically simplified nutrient management plans. These are essentially available for landowners that are receiving manure from concentrated animal operations, or CAFOs. So it's much more simplified. It kind of takes the place of a nutrient management plan on an agricultural operation that is not a CAO. or is not a VAO. So just keep that in mind. You'll, as you go through our certification program, if you're doing so, you'll learn more about that. Next slide, please. Here's some good information, some links on the Nutrient Management Act program. The Agronomy Fact Sheet 40 gives you more background on the nutrient management legislation itself and the regulations and all the criteria that are rolled into the regulations that influence the content of a nutrient management plan. And then Fact Sheet 54 is basically almost a step-by-step reading of who actually needs to develop an Act 38 plan. So that is a good piece of information if you're going out to meet a producer for the very, very first time. Is take that Fact Sheet 54 with you, and you can review that with them. It's going to give the producer and you as the coordinating agency to figuring out, okay, along maybe even with that chart that Kate showed you a few minutes ago as to whether you need a Act 38 plan or a manure management plan. This document is a very good instructional document, and they're available on the nutrient management website that is hosted by Penn State Cooperative Extension. So you can just follow that link and find those fact sheets. Next, please. The Act 38 Odor Management Program, that is a separate program that kind of runs parallel with our Act 38 Nutrient Management Program. Back in 2005, when the Act 38 legislation was revised, it included odor management, the provision for development of odor management plans on CAOs. Basically, the odor management plan is to address the potential for impacts of off-site migration of odors from animal housing and manure storage facilities. This does not address odors that emanate from field application. That's almost impossible to regulate, but at least we had the opportunity under the odor management program to regulate and assist in the management of migration of odors from those two circumstances. It establishes the planning and the implementation criteria very, very similar to what the nutrient management section of Act 38 does. So we have a set of regulations that establishes the planning and implementation criteria that are necessary for odor management plans. The community that is most affected by odor management plans are the concentrated animal operations. And VAOs could also develop an odor management plan if they wanted to, but it is required by a CAO, particularly if you have a new animal housing unit or a new storage unit. The odor management plan is very site specific. Under the program, we assess the environment around the agricultural site where we might be putting a new animal housing unit or manure storage to see what the odor impacts may be. The odor site index is that tool by which we evaluate the potential impacts around that agricultural operation from odor migration. The plan will also identify the odor BMPs that are necessary to manage those impacts. A good example of an odor management BMP would be some type of a windbreak barrier, a vegetative windbreak barrier, etc. That's probably a more commonly used BMP to help mitigate the movement of odors from a facility. Just to keep in mind is, though, this is just to help mitigate the movement of odors. It's not to completely eliminate odors. There's no way you can possibly do that. So we're just trying to reduce the impacts on the community from this particular type of an agricultural operation. Next slide, please. As I noticed before, odor management plans similar to nutrient management plans are necessary for ag operations that are CAOs or CAFOs, new animal housing or manure storage, new constructed portions of an expanded facility. So if, for example, there was an existing livestock housing unit there and they did a significant expansion, the odor management plan would apply to that expansion of that housing unit and any associated manure facility as well with that expansion. The plans are reviewed and approved by the State Conservation Commission. We currently do not delegate that responsibility to conservation districts. However, districts may help us in the education aspect of the odor management program. And once again, I would reemphasize that if you're going out and talking to a landowner and he's planning to put up a whole new animal enterprise, he has a beef operation, but now he's going to also put a couple poultry houses up, and now that that pushes him into a CAO category. He has to develop a nutrient management plan. The next conversation should be the development of an odor management plan as well. You really can't leave that discussion without talking about both, and then also talking about the coordination of an Ag E&S plan, because certainly with development of new housing facilities and development of manure storages, that certainly is probably going to impact the Ag E&S plan or the conservation plan. So once again, here's the opportunity for coordination of partnership roles to ensure that all these management plans that need to be developed for a project are there and they're consistently working to each other. Okay, next slide, please. There's more information that you can on the odor management plan on the State Conservation Commission's website. So you can follow the breadcrumb trail there to the Department of Agriculture's website and then down to the odor management plan. Next, please. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to spend just a few moments here on some ancillary regulations and laws that may impact the project that you're working with the agricultural operator on his property. First and foremost is invasive species. You can see the definition of an invasive species. I don't need to read that to you, but basically you need to be cognizant of the fact that in Pennsylvania, there is a Pennsylvania Invasive Species Council, and there is a National Invasive Species Council, which are both charged with the detection, identification, and control of invasive species, both in the aquatic and the terrestrial environment. Because as you all well know, there's opportunity to come across some invasive species, and the project shouldn't be that the farmer is working on. We shouldn't be causing further development of that invasive species in the project area for the landowner. So this is more of an awareness type of conversation. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. There is a noxious weed control law in Pennsylvania. The regulatory authority is through the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. The big thing here is the identification and understanding where there may be invasive species on the property and how to manage, working with the landowner to manage those invasive species so the project doesn't inadvertently expand the impact of the invasive species that may be in a specific project area. There's a typical listing of some of the invasive species that you may come across on an agricultural operation and should be properly managed during the course of the construction or the implementation of the BMPs in that particular project. And there are mechanisms to doing so. There's a more expansive list that is noted there in the DCNR link, and you can certainly look into that at your leisure. Next slide, please. Some contacts for invasive species identification. Penn State Cooperative Extension offices have personnel that could help landowners and help you as an agency working with the farmer in identification of any noxious weeds that may be on the property at the project site. Eradication, if it's an excessive invasive species presence there at the project, agriculture, to look for remedies to help eradication of the noxious weed infestation. For the most part, some of the aquatic invasive species you're not going to get involved with and probably not going to be exposed to in your projects. It's more so these noxious weed infestations that may be prevalent, and the farmer may have known this for a while. He's been trying to control it, but now the project area maybe also have expedite the need to control those noxious weed infestations. So just some information on that. Next slide, please. There's some more additional information for DCNR and the USDA National Invasive Species Information Center that you can explore at your leisure. Next, please. Couple more slides here. Local nutrient and odor management ordinances. While we do have our state level nutrient management regulations and legislation for to cover nutrient management and odor management issues, local municipalities still may pass and they may implement certain local water quality regulations through ordinances to help manage activities at the local level. Lots of times, some of these ordinances may have to deal with the storage and the handling and use of manure, or the location or the construction of a particular storage facility or particular animal housing unit on the operation. And that's perfectly fine. However, there by law under Act 38, any of those local nutrient management ordinances need to be consistent and may not be more stringent than Act 38. For example, if a local manure management ordinances requires all agricultural operations in that municipality to have an Act 38 nutrient management plan, on the surface that may sound well and good, but if you think about it for a moment, it's saying that all animal operations, which is inconsistent with Act 38. There's only a certain community of animal operations, as we saw in the diagrams earlier, that need to have an Act 38 plan. That ordinance would have to be changed to say all, if they wanted to re-emphasize that all CAOs in that municipality need to have an Act 38 plan, their ordinance may say that, but it may not say that all animal operations have to have an Act 38 nutrient management plan. So that's an example of the stringency and the consistency issue related to that. Non-odor management or non-nutrient management ordinances are not affected by this consistency, stringency issue. Basically, that points to if you have if there needs to be setbacks for placement of an animal, housing unit or manure storage, the municipality may certainly have those ordinances in effect. If there is an ordinance that the farmer feels is providing undue impacts or inappropriate for his project, the farmer may challenge that particular local ordinance to the Attorney General's office, the State Attorney General's office. When Act 38 was revised in created in 2005, it created the opportunity for the Attorney General to review any of the local ordinances to see whether or not they were consistent or inconsistent with any state level regulations or laws. So that's an opportunity for the farmer to get involved in managing local ordinances that may be inappropriate in his municipality. Next slide, please. The right to farm law. This is another particular state ordinance that may not necessarily affect the project, but that you're working with the ag producer, but it's just more of information for you as the agency working with the farmer to understand what is and is not allowed under the right to farm law. This does limit the establishment of agricultural nuisance suits and ordinances, basically if they're in conflict with the normal, customary, and generally accepted farming activities. For example, if they say, well, no, you can't have any An ordinance would say the decibel level leaving the farming operation cannot exceed such and such over between the hours of 8 to 4. That would probably be a nuisance ordinance, and it could be challenged. That it's not an appropriate ordinance. It severely restricts the customary and generally accepted farming activities. It excludes farms from public nuisance ordinances unless there's that activity has a public health or safety impact. Then that particular ordinance may apply. It does not restrict the rights, however, for a neighbor to a farming operation to recover damages. If there's some type of health and safety issue that arose from normal farming and generally accepted farming activities, and it did impose damage to a neighboring property, that neighbor still has the right to recover damages. It does not exclude farmers from paying damages if their activities created such a situation. Next slide, please. And finally, the right to know law. This is where we get into the accessibility of many of these resource management plans that are developed to meet regulatory requirements on the ag operation. You and I, as citizens of the Commonwealth, have the right to access any public records. Generally, a public record is a certain record that's maintained by the conservation districts and it's subject to public access. This includes the 102 Ag E&S plans, the manure management plans under Chapter 91, the nutrient management plans and odor management plans under Act 38. Since they are generated under public law, they are accessible to the general public. Now, granted, the Ag E&S plan and the manure management plan generally, they don't have to be approved like the nutrient management and the odor management plan, so they may only be held on file by the landowner. But however, if they were submitted to the conservation district for some particular purpose, they would generally be on file with the conservation district, and then they are accessible to the general public. It is, if the document is only held by the landowner, on file by the landowner, it's not in a public held on file in a public office like the conservation district, it generally will not be accessible to the general public unless an individual goes directly to the owner of that plan. Nutrient management plans and odor management plans by default under their legislation are publicly accessible once they've been approved by the county conservation district or the state conservation commission. Each conservation district should have a right to know public access policy. It would behoove you to talk to your district manager or your supervisor to make sure you fully understand the district's public access policy for some of these documents. As was mentioned, earlier, the conservation plans developed by NRCS, conservation districts do not have the right to make those available to the general public. Those can only be released through a release by the landowner themselves. So that's the only difference here. We've got slightly different public access management criteria at the federal level and the state level. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that takes care of our instructional conversation this morning. Tim, how would you like us to deal with we have a couple questions here.
There's a question in the chat box before we move on, John. Are
Okay.
plans that have been emailed to the district for review but are not saved at the district subject to right to know?
I guess that would depend on the type of plan. Definitely the nutrient management plans that were submitted to the district for review. They had to go through review and approval process, and they have to be kept on file with the Conservation District. The Ag E&S plans, the manure management plans, if they're not saved at the Conservation District, if the farmer just sent them in and asked the district to look at them to make sure they were on the right track with their Ag E&S plan and their manure management plan, and the final copy was not on file with the Conservation District, the farmer kept that on file at his own business or premise, then they would not be subject to the right to know. It's only the documents that are held by the Conservation District in their publicly accessible office that would be available for public access. So if the district doesn't have a Ag E&S plan or manure management plan for Farmer Joe, then it would not be subject to the right to know law.
Thanks, John. Very good. So for the questions for the participants, just so that you are aware, we're going to have you for this presentation just provide an answer in the chat box. And we're going to use responses to this quiz and to our other questions that we're going to ask throughout the week as just documentation that people have been participating in the course. So I know that there are going to be times when you maybe have to step away for a minute or two, or you get an important phone call or something, and you may miss a question or two, but we're looking for a majority of the questions to be answered by you to get credit for the course. And we're not even going to require correct answers. We're just looking for responses of some sort that show you have participated. So please participate. And John, with that, let's jump into your quiz quickly.
Okay, first question. When would an Ag E&S plan be required? A, operation practices continuous no-till. B, operation practices tillage. C, animals cause earth disturbance equal to or greater than 5,000 square feet, or all of the above.
So let's give you just 10 seconds to answer, and then we'll give the answer.
Right. And Kate, please chime in. Since I think this probably covers more of your portion of the presentation. So.
We're getting lots of answers, and they're all the same.
Lots of answers. Yep.
Well, I see lots of D's, John. How does D sound?
D would be the correct answer.
Very good. Thank you. Go ahead with number 2.
Go to number 2. True or false? Only CAOs and CAFOs are regulated. Once again, these guys have been paying attention. Everybody's been paying attention, which is good. That is a false statement. Under Chapter 91 of the Clean Streams Law, all animal operations theoretically are regulated because they have to provide a manure management plan. Am I incorrect on that statement, Kate?
You're correct. Sorry, I was having some trouble unmuting myself earlier. There was the chat blew up in front of my unmute button.
Yeah, it did. It did so. This next question, true or false, with regard to Chapter 105, construction activities cannot proceed until approval or acknowledgement is received by the DEP, from DEP or the delegated conservation district. True or false? Construction cannot proceed on Chapter 105, which are the general permits, until approval or acknowledgement is received from DEP. Okay, Kate, are you in agreement with all the responses?
Yeah, it looks like everybody was paying attention. That is true.
Definitely, definitely. And then finally, number 4, true or false, a local ordinance may be more stringent than the Act 38 requirements. Guess I should have made that a local manure management ordinance may be more stringent than Act 38 requirements. Very good. False. It may not be more stringent than the Act 38 requirements. So thank you all for participating. I know it's early in the instructional conversation, so your minds are fresher right now. Hopefully you can be as responsive as we go through the rest of the week.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John and Kate. We really appreciate that. And as their last slide shows, I think it's the last slide.
There's one after
Contact them.
this.
Oh, okay. I apologize. Let me jump down to
Yeah.
their last slide. Oh, there we go. There are the contact numbers. So everyone should have that in the presentation. You should have been able to retrieve that from the website link that was provided. And if you weren't able to do that, reach out to me and I will make sure you get that. So big thanks. Thank you, John and Kate. We really appreciate having you this morning. And hopefully that is a good resource for people in the future. So thank you very much. The next thing, moving on, we are scheduled for a break. Before we do the break, though, is Peter Hoagland on? I had a question for Peter.
I am on, yes.
Peter, hey, we have a question for forestry. I didn't know if you wanted to ask your question from the MS Teams forum now so people can answer before your presentation starts, or if you prefer to ask it later during your presentation.
Yeah, let's shoot for later during the presentation and let everybody have a break.
Sounds good. We will do
Okay.
our break then. We're going to do a 10-minute break before Peter starts. I'm going to start a countdown clock. So if everyone would be back in 10 minutes, which will be about 9:54. So thank you, everyone. We're chugging along. So we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Tim, you're banking on the fact they're going to sit in front of their computer and watch that countdown.
What's that, John?
I said you're banking on the fact that they're going to sit in front of their computer and watch that countdown.
Well, we'll see.
It's good to
thanks a lot.
have them.
Thanks a lot, John. Much appreciated your involvement today.
Hey, thanks for advancing the slides for us. That was very helpful.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Hey, have a good rest of the morning.
You as well.
Yep. Bye.
Hey, Tim, this is Peter. Sorry, I was testing sharing my screen and I think that kicked out your countdown clock.
All right, our 10-minute break is up, and I see a question did come in from Amanda. Are we currently dealing with the right to know mineral management while we're dealing with the topic? If we do not have a plan on file, is someone able to request it from the farmer? That's a good question. I see that John and Kate they both jumped off the meeting at this point, so I did email John, and when I get an answer, Amanda, I will provide that back to the group. But we'll move on. Our next presentation is going to be on forestry, and that is going to be presented by the NRCS Pennsylvania State Forester, Peter Hoagland. And Peter's worked across the country, on the other side of the country for a while, and has settled in Pennsylvania for the past several years. So at this point, Peter, I will pass it on to you. Thank you very much. And Peter, I think you must be muted. I don't hear you right now. And then, by the way, just let me know when you want your question shared.
Okay, I think I'm
There we
unmuted
go.
now. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I see it. Yep.
Okay, and you're seeing the full screen, not this instructor
Correct.
display or whatever. Okay,
It looks
great.
appropriate. Yep, very good.
All right, thank you, Tim. And I'll probably call on you to launch that poll in a couple slides here. All right, so like Tim said, my name is Peter Hoagland. I am the state forester for NRCS in Pennsylvania, and I will not jump into all my background, but yeah, I've been here for about 6 years now or so. Worked in other areas of the country, other agencies, and bounced around a little bit. But happy to be here and try and impart some forestry knowledge on you all. And here are my objectives for the presentation here. We're going to go into a little bit of background on forestry in Pennsylvania, talk about some of the NRCS forestry related conservation practices, resource concerns, and talk a little bit about how forestry works, the roles of partners throughout the state. But before we jump into that, and I don't know if I can actually see the chat, maybe I can. I gotta move some stuff around, but I know that most of you guys are here to attend this training as a prerequisite to become a conservation planner or to gain some additional knowledge. And I'd hope that if that's right, part of your position, you're going to want to be an effective conservation planner. So before we first jump into forestry, I'd like to open it up for some interaction. And I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on what are some traits of an effective conservation planner. So maybe throw some stuff into the chat. I'll move some screens around here so that I can see what's going on. And if you can unmute and you can tell me what you think it takes to be an effective conservation planner. I'll leave it open for a minute. So Allison said listening to producers, being a good listener. Carissa said knowledgeable about conservation practices, an active listener, understanding the goal of the landowner. James said being thorough. That some excellent feedback, and we're still getting a few folks chiming in. Big picture systems, understanding natural resources, human interactions, the ability to collaborate and use multiple funding sources. That's a key thing. Being very knowledgeable and detail oriented, knowledgeable of the conservation practices and understanding the goals. So all these things that we're talking about are not particular to forestry. They're not particular to engineering, Act 38 stuff. Willing to try new approaches and new and different approaches, knowledgeable about the landscapes. This is some really excellent feedback. And so I'm going to throw up on the screen some of the things that I think it takes to be an effective conservation planner. Developing that relationship with your customer, learning how they operate. Learn who your partners are. Just like throughout the course of this training, like Secretary Rudding said, like Pete said, like Carl said, we really rely on our partners throughout the state. We look at what they have to offer and how those partnerships can help the customers that we support. And you got to know your soils. You got to know the flora, the fauna. and the different things that are focused in your different area. And know your resource concerns, be able to identify resource concerns, know the conservation practices that can treat resource concerns, and also keeping abreast of the current and latest technology and research and natural resources issues. I think the comment that was loaded about MMP should be available for review by DEP. Okay, that's something related probably to the last presentation. But thank you for that interaction. I think that's good and kind of sets us off on a right start and talking about how we're going to interact with our clients and how we can be an effective conservation planner. So by now you're thinking, wait, come on, forestry. This is actually called Agricultural Conservation Technical Training, and what does that have to do with forestry? Well, you're right, that's what it's called. But we are going to talk a little bit about forestry, and slowly over the past couple of years since I've been participating in this, I've been able to bump up. I think we added 15 more minutes this year, so we're increasing our forestry capacity a little bit. But so if you're a solely ag type person, please don't fall asleep on me. Just think of it as a really, really long-term perennial crop. And there is the majority of Pennsylvania is in the forest land use as opposed to just ag land use. So not to harp on ag lands, but forests are really important too. So forestry conservation incorporates management activities in order to achieve conservation outcomes and desired conditions and benefits. All right, so what are those benefits? Why don't you throw in the chat some benefits that you guys think about when you think of forestry, and I will respond with some of the ones that I think about when I think of forestry. All right, carbon sequestration, excellent. Habitat, that's good. Habitat for fish and wildlife, biodiversity, excellent. Diverse habitats, we're getting a lot of connections to wildlife, and we do a lot of work for improving wildlife habitat in forest lands through NRCS, helping control water runoff through buffers, riparian forest buffers. Great. Here are some of the conservation benefits. All right, we're getting a few more. Increased water infiltration, excellent. Clean air, groundwater recharge, carbon sequestration, wildlife, early successional habitat, fire control. That's an interesting one. We don't do a lot of fire management. We're not really an extremely high-risk fire state, but certainly there is an opportunity and some fire risk in Pennsylvania. All right, so here are the conservation benefits that I think about and that we typically talk about with forest management. I'm talking about conservation benefits, wildlife habitat, a lot of you guys touched on that, water quality, restoring damaged ecosystems, and improving forest health and resilience. That's talking about climate resilience and resilience to stressors like invasive species or other stressors. And then there's also a lot of landowner benefits too, like supplemental income from sustainable timber harvest, recreation and hunting. That is probably the #1 benefit that landowners are looking for. Besides just wildlife habitat, they're looking for just getting out and enjoying their property, and investment opportunities too. Okay, so with forestry, everything starts with a plan, just like with other land uses. For forests, that's a forest management plan. This is kind of what a forest management plan looks like. And this is a site-specific plan that addresses one or more resource concerns and recommends conservation activities based on inventory, to achieve desired future conditions. There are a couple different types of forest management plans. The one we normally talk about is an NRCS Conservation Activity Plan, CAP 106. That's a forest management plan. But that can also include a forest stewardship plan, which is a program managed by the U.S. Forest Service. That can also include a tree farm plan that meets the National Forest Management Plan template. And that can also include other plans meeting NRCS criteria that are approved by the NRCS state conservationists. So that can include plans written by organizations like the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, has a plan that they're writing for their Forest Stewardship Network program. One thing to keep in mind that for NRCS, only qualified technical service providers, TSPs, can write CAP 106 plans. Somebody else threw in about benefits, food, mushrooms, ginseng. That's a great thought. Thinking about forest farming, additional practices that can be included to help get somebody thinking about conservation in their forest lands. All right, so why would a client need a forest management plan? Well, it's a valuable tool. It kind of guides their management based on their desired outcomes, their desired future conditions, and it documents the current state, the current conditions, their goals, and makes a plan of action designed to address the resource concerns that are currently existing on their property. So there are 6 general components of a forest management plan. It can include some basic things like site and plan information. It documents the client's objectives. It provides an inventory and assessment of the existing conditions on the forest and makes a recommendation, a schedule of operations, of practices that can be enacted to achieve desired future conditions. And then there's also some documentation like maps and other deliverables that can be included in a forest management plan or are included in a forest management plan. So as a conservation planner, you really have to have a basic familiarity with the types of plans that can be prepared for forest lands and have a familiarity with the commonly utilized forestry practices and forestry terminology. And you have to become familiar with the associated materials necessary to add forestry conservation practices into a conservation plan for a client. Just throw this in here as a basic understanding. NRCS has a pretty broad definition of forest, and this includes areas that are at least 10% stocked, which looks like 25% or greater canopy cover. It also includes a minimum acreage greater than 1 acre. It has a minimum width of 100 feet wide. But this can also include lands where forests can regenerate, but are not currently being utilized for another land use like a cropland or a pasture land. So the definition says lands bearing evidence of natural regeneration of tree cover. And in Pennsylvania, that can be pretty much anywhere because historically, Pennsylvania was almost 90% forested. Currently, forests cover about 58% of Pennsylvania, about 11.7 million acres of private forest lands, approximately 738,000 private forest landowners that have greater than 1 acre. When you narrow that down to greater than 10 acres, it cuts that down a little bit. About 500,000 or so folks have greater than 10 acres. And throughout Pennsylvania, there's about 4.8 million acres of public lands, meaning state lands, state forests, state parks, or federally owned lands like the Allegheny National Forest. And this really contributes to a huge portion of Pennsylvania's economy. The timber industry is about a $5 billion per year industry in Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of tourism contributions from forests in Pennsylvania too. So this is kind of what the forest ownership looks like across Pennsylvania. This is pretty pixelated, but there is forest land in every county of the state, but you'll notice that there is considerably less in the southeast counties due to ag lands and a lot of development coming online too. And I'm not sure if this is a little blurry or not, but forest looks what forests look like across Pennsylvania varies a little bit as much as ownership, but we do have 2 general forest types that are widespread across regions of Pennsylvania. Generally in the northern area of Pennsylvania, predominantly maple, beech, and birch forest types. And the southern half of the state is largely oak hickory forests. This web map that I'm referring to here is coming from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program that breaks out the predominant forest group types that we have in Pennsylvania. So a little bit about our forestry history. Pennsylvania used to be about 29 million acres of forest prior to colonial settlement. Forests likely covered about 90+% of the state. And there's some major components that are largely lost from our forests, like chestnut. American chestnut was a major component of our forest, which is all but gone now. Prior to commercial development that allowed for widespread timber harvest, a lot of land was cleared just for agriculture. And there's some major industries that put a demand on timber supply in our forests, like in the 1700s, the iron industry. It's estimated that about 3.5 million acres of Pennsylvania's forests were cut to feed the Pennsylvania iron industry. And you see remnants of that in our forests now. You see iron, I forget what they're called, but the iron charcoal structures. And then in the 1840s, 1850s, white pine was in huge demand for ship mass. Other industries put demand on the state's timber resources, such as the leather tanning industry, the wood chemical business, potash production. And eventually there was largely uncontrolled logging that eventually led to really vastly depleted forests by the early 1900s and contributed to some serious excessive erosion, mudslides, and you'd be surprised, but there were some really large uncontrollable fires in cutover areas too. This was all kind of coinciding with key movements like conservation movement and preservation movements in the early 1900s. State forests were beginning to be formed to help with the replanting effort. In 1905, the Department of Forests was created. And there were some key players like Gifford Pinchot was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. He was also a governor of Pennsylvania. And that has led to kind of what we have in our forests now. If we go back, here's a cool historical look. This forest in the Little Arnott Run on the Allegheny Plateau has been documented continuously since 1927. It's a little bit blurry, but if you look, it was clear cut for saw timber. There were many seedlings in place across the area. And since then, that area, the forest has been left to develop naturally with very little disturbance. And if we keep on moving forward, you can notice in the 2008 picture and in the 2018 picture in the forest understory is now being overrun by invasive brush species. So if we were to think about the forests in the 1950s, 1960s, it would have been dramatically increased. The age class diversity would have been dramatically increased, and the average tree size of the forest would have been dramatically increased if we had prescribed a silvicultural thinning to remove some of the undesirable tree species coming up in those 1950s eras. So the results of these past forest management practices like this one I just showed is that the typical forest age class distribution in Pennsylvania is an even-aged forest, meaning that the majority of the trees in the forest are about the same size, or sorry, about the same age, regardless of size. And that places the forest into generally what's called a stem exclusion phase, where the species distribution has shifted towards shade tolerant species like red maple and away from shade intolerant species like red oak. Sorry about that. Excuse me, I'm gonna mute for just a second and close. Trust me, that wasn't my phone. So if you pay attention to the fact on this graph that there's really little representation in the younger age classes, which means that there's an impact on new trees getting established, which is called natural regeneration. And this can be due to shading, which can limit plant species, and we'll be able to get this will limit which plant species will be able to get established, but it can also be impacts from deer browse, invasive plant species, invasive insects, and the lack of natural disturbance, including fire suppression. And that line right there is kind of what we're looking for generally to get back to, give or take. We want higher levels of representation in those younger age classes. So this is a normal view in Pennsylvania's Ridge and Valley physiogeographic province, and some might call it picturesque. But if you look at it closer, what we see here is a forest lacking in age class diversity. So diverse age structure is beneficial because trees are most vulnerable to specific stressors at different ages. So for example, droughts are typically more damaging to seedlings than to mature trees, whereas older individuals might be more susceptible to damage from high wind events. And I saw a message. Okay, yeah, thanks for catching that. The furnaces and the charcoal hearths. I'm not catching up with the chat very quickly. And James mentioned that what we're seeing is mesification in our forests. All right, and another impact to the health of our forests is human-induced impact due to the non-sustainable practices that are happening. And one of those is diameter limit cutting. This is where everything over a certain diameter is harvested, which often leaves behind poorly formed trees and takes no consideration for regeneration of the next forest. And I want to focus on this just for a minute because this is really common in privately owned forests throughout Pennsylvania. And it's not an acceptable forestry practice, but it's extremely common. And it's one thing that, if anything that you take away from this, this is the one thing that we should be discouraging. Some people refer to this as high grading, diameter limit cutting. Basically, this is where you're cutting the best and leaving the rest. So this favors some short-term economic advantages, but it leads to the devaluation of timber quality and other ecological benefits. So when seed sources for desirable species and good genetics are removed from a forest through diameter limit cutting, what often results is something like this picture. And Dr. Finley from Penn State, I think he just recently retired, called situations like this a green lie, meaning that landowners might think that everything is fine just because they got to see a green out there. But if you look closer to this area, what's in this forest, if we put it in air quotes here, what's in this forest is made up of plants that are undesirable for markets. They're undesirable for wildlife. And what remains is plants that interfere with the regeneration of a future forest. So if you look closer, what you see in this picture are ferns in the understory, hay-scented ferns in the understory probably. And the overstory is predominantly I believe this overstory is striped maple. So these are species that are ecologically undesirable because they shade out the understory, they limit establishment of new seedlings or regeneration. And honestly, in a forest with an understory of hay-scented fern like that, if you do get some regeneration established, some desirable regeneration like oaks popping up, the deer do not want to eat the fern. They'll go right for the oaks. It's like a lollipop for them. In contrast, this picture is from a site where NRCS contracted a shelter woodcut to create early successional habitat for wildlife species, probably for golden wing warbler habitat. This site is now an uneven-aged forest with way more diversity. What you see in the understory here is desirable species that are getting established, and this is going to be a really diverse forest age structure in throughout the forest. So I've talked about one prevalent issue in our forest related to age class diversity, but there are also a host of other issues in our forest that can equate to NRCS resource concerns. And I know the other presenters haven't gotten into this quite yet. So what is a resource concern? It's a degradation of the soil, the water, the air, the plant, or the animal resource base to the extent that the sustainability or intended use of the resource is impaired. So in forest lands conservation planning, NRCS is usually dealing with plant condition related resource concerns, but it's not uncommon for there to be other resource concerns identified on forest lands that may relate to wildlife habitat or soil erosion or water quality issues. Our ultimate goal with conservation, though, is to address these resource concerns to make improvements that will deliver environmental benefits. So here are the typical forest related resource concerns that we're normally dealing with. Plant productivity and health, plant structure and composition, and plant pest pressure. And then also often dealing with habitat for fish and wildlife and invertebrates. So I'm going to touch base a little bit on these various resource concerns, starting with plant productivity and health. And on each of these slides, you're going to see something called planning criteria. So planning criteria are the qualitative and quantitative statements of the minimum level of treatment required to address a given resource concern. So planning criteria are established for all NRCS resource concerns and might be assessed using specific tools or through client input and planner observation. And they're all listed in documents on the NRCS Field Office Technical Guide. So plant productivity and health can be limited by undesirable or native species like hay-scented fern because of the fern's overabundance and the fact that it's not allowing any trees to regenerate or occur on the site, like in this picture. Plant structure and composition in forests refers to the vegetated diversity of a site. A site that's a monoculture of one tree species will have little value to wildlife that require a mix of species for habitat. Also, a monoculture site will not be able to be as resilient to some of the diseases and insect infestations and competing invasive vegetation stressing Pennsylvania's forests. And stand structure refers to the physical arrangement of the vegetation in forest land. So generally a stand with more structure has more habitat components for wildlife. And plant pest pressure. This is a resource concern that we probably deal with on almost every client's forest. We're primarily dealing with invasive and noxious plant species because they can put pressure on native and desirable species by stressing and outcompeting or killing native species. So these impacts can alter plant communities. They can alter species diversity and composition and the structure of the forests. We also certainly have our fair share of invasive insect pests and diseases that are putting pressure on our forests, like spotted lanternfly that you probably have all heard about so far, emerald ash borer, cherry scallop shell moth, gypsy moths, oak wilt, hemlock woolly adelgid, beech bark disease, beech leaf disease, walnut twig beetle. We could go on. So NRCS practices tend to be limited in what they can do to directly address insects and disease infestations because of the overlap with jurisdiction with other agencies, like APHIS, the Animal Plant Health and Inspection Service, and the fact that the insects are less static than plant pests. But the resulting impact of these pests can certainly have a lasting impact on the structure and composition and health of our forests. So John mentioned this a little bit. Pennsylvania has a controlled plants and noxious weed law that was passed in 2017. And it was amended in 2019. Might have been amended one more time after that. And so this is a regulatory list that falls under the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture. The law amended, made changes to a list that previously only had 13 species and now breaks it out into Class A species and Class B species. The Class A species are the state's highest priority species, meaning that the state wants to prevent new infestations and eradicate existing infestations of these species in Class A. Class B means that the state wants to control the existing infestations from spreading significantly and beyond the mere control in certain cases. And then also, John mentioned this, DCNR, Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, maintains an invasive plants list, which is much larger than the noxious species list, but this is not necessarily a regulatory list. It includes a lot of species that are not native to the state, but are known to grow extremely aggressively. All right, and here's another resource concern that we're dealing with a lot, terrestrial habitat for wildlife and invertebrates. In this picture here is a golden wing warbler, and it's one of our focal species that we have in particular areas of Pennsylvania that we have programs that we're specifically managing for under the Working Lands for Wildlife program. So in assessing this resource concern, we utilize tools called a wildlife habitat evaluation guide, of which we have for forest lands, but we also have wildlife habitat evaluation guides available on the field office technical guide for other land uses to assess the status, the state of habitat, or what that habitat is lacking. All right, so I'm gonna jump into some of the forestry related conservation practices. And Tim, if I'm starting to get close on time, please give me a shout out.
You're fine. We can be flexible in the schedule, and we've got time. We'll get people out by lunchtime, so that's our goal.
Okay, thank you. All right, so forest stand improvement. This is kind of the bread and butter practice of forestry. So to address forest resource concerns in the forest management plan, they might the technical service provider or the consulting forester might often recommend forest stand improvement. And there's I would say there's many flavors to forest stand improvement. This can include changing species composition and structure and tree density by killing some trees. Includes silvicultural activities like a crop tree release, where you're focusing on certain species that are going to provide, say, mast for wildlife species, or shelter wood cuts, or patched cuts, or forest openings, or removing some of the shade in the forest understory, or even coppice regeneration methods for aspen that we want species to stump sprout from. And all this is recommended based on the inventory that the consulting forester or the technical service provider is conducting on site. So in the advanced boot camp, we're going to go more into the specific silvicultural methods. But at this point, it's sufficient to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all treatment when it comes to forests. And that really needs to be based on the client's objectives, but also on the inventory on the site and what's realistic for the forest on the site. Here's another shot of a post-treatment after the forest stand improvement cut. So this cut opened up the canopy and left behind some scattered large seed trees that will help to populate the understory and create a forest with multiple age classes. And some folks might not think that this looks pretty, but what this is really doing, if you see what's left behind, the trees that are marked in red right there, those are the seed producing trees. That's going to provide provide the seed source for the understory. And in comparison, if it were a diameter limit cut, those would be the trees that would have been taken out probably. Okay, another key practice is tree and shrub establishment. So this is a practice used for tree planting, obviously in forest lands and other settings to help improve plant diversity, also to improve habitat. So it can provide a whole host of conservation benefits like soil protection, water and air quality improvement, and improvement to species diversity on the site. Included within that conservation practice, and I realize this isn't a great photo, but included within that conservation practices are something called regeneration area protection measures, like this regeneration area protection fence. You'll notice on the left-hand side, you can kind of see, I don't know how well you can see, but there is a large fence right in through there on the left-hand side of that road. On the inside of that fence, there was a silvicultural treatment, and there's regeneration getting established. And that fence is protecting that regeneration so it can get out of a browse line and get sufficiently established, and that fence could get taken down after the regeneration gets established to promote, this one specifically is promoting early successional habitat. And obviously, we do a ton of this, but invasive species treatments, which include herbaceous weed treatment and brush management. These practices focus on treating areas to obviously improve site conditions for an established forest by reducing competition from undesirable species, which includes invasive species and noxious species. And to be quite honest, this is probably the number one reason why a landowner is seeking assistance. As a conservation planner, it's important to be able to recognize the problematic species that we have in Pennsylvania, those species that need controlled treatments, as well as kind of gauging the degree of infestation. Some species will require multiple treatments, which are often done with broad spectrum foliar or pre-emergent herbicides. However, if you're an NRCS employee or working under an NRCS agreement, you do have to follow pest management policies, which state that NRCS can't recommend specific pesticide formulations. So we can't say, oh, that needs Roundup. We need to hit that with Roundup. We can't do that. We can say we need to control those species using a broad spectrum herbicide, but we cannot prescribe a specific formulation. All right, here's another conservation practice that's often utilized in forests to reduce erosion. It's called forest trails and landings. We often install rolling dips or water bars on forest trails where there's some sort of gully erosion concern that is transporting sediments to a waterway or otherwise. This is typically utilized in steeper areas, but it is not uncommon to see gullies coming down a poorly planned road in a forest land setting. And then here's another practice that we don't do a lot of yet in Pennsylvania, but we can. And there's some movement at the state level to potentially bolster some prescribed burning practice on forest land. So it's not widespread in Pennsylvania due to the lack of available contractors, but it is extremely cost-efficient practice to address forest health issues as well as reducing invasive species, and as well as promoting regeneration. A lot of species respond favorably to fire, and put up a lot of new regeneration growth post-fire. We utilize riparian forest buffer a lot, and this is considered an agroforestry practice. I'm going to touch on a couple of agroforestry practices that we have. And this is often used to reestablish riparian vegetation along streams so as to reduce nutrients and sediments impacting water quality. Another agroforestry practice that you may not have heard about is alley cropping. This is when an agricultural crop is grown simultaneously with a long-term tree crop to provide annual income while the tree crop matures. So NRCS actually has a current funded conservation innovation grant project with PASA looking at alley cropping. So this can include a whole host of things like high value hardwoods like walnuts or oaks within the alley systems that could eventually be used for lumber or veneer logs, but it could also be nut crops or other shorter term products or intermediate products. In this picture, I think it's walnuts with hay in between the rows of alleys. Somebody referred to this in a comment earlier. And I apologize, I'm not keeping up with all the comments. I'll try to swing back by on the comments later. So forest farming, it's currently called multi-story cropping. NRCS is changing the name of that to forest farming at the national level. It is the cultivation of high-value specialty crops under the protection of forest canopy that's been modified to provide the correct shade level, and that can include crops like ginseng, shiitake mushrooms, golden seal, ramps in Pennsylvania. Stuff that can be sold for medicinal or culinary or ornamental uses too. So it can provide income while high quality trees are being grown for wood products, similar to alley cropping, but in a forested setting as opposed to adding trees into an ag setting. And this is far different from agricultural farming. We're not doing tillage or soil amendments. Soil amendments could be possible in forest farming. But in eastern forests, many forest farmers don't employ traditional agricultural practices for forest farming. Instead, they use a variety of plant husbandry practices, often with natural rather than planted stands of non-timber forest projects. And then windbreaks and shelter belt establishment. They're linear plantings of trees and shrubs designed to enhance crop production, protect people and livestock, and benefit soil and water conservation. And just like other practices, there are several different types of windbreaks. There's field windbreaks that provide wind protection to wind-sensitive crops, control wind erosion. You'll see those a lot more in the Midwest and Western states. But they can also be kind of overlapped to increase pollination, reduce pesticide drift, or increase pesticide effectiveness. And then we're also seeing a lot more windbreaks around poultry houses to aid in reducing odor and dust, as well as providing visual and noise barriers in Pennsylvania. And that's what the picture on the right is showing around a poultry house. All right, in the few more minutes I have left, I want to touch quickly on the roles of forest management. And this is kind of how it works in Pennsylvania. Obviously, you have the client who is the decision maker and chooses the treatments to implement. And that's going to be the same in pretty much everything that NRCS is involved in. The client is the final decision maker. The conservation planner guides that planning process and develops the conservation plan in coordination with the client and foresters and forestry professionals. And then we are lucky to have a few agency foresters. James is in this training, and we're happy to have him as one of our NRCS foresters. But we also have a memorandum of agreement with DCNR, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, to tap into the technical expertise of the DCNR service foresters, of which there is usually one covering every county Some cover a few counties. So those folks provide quality assurance, the review of planned and implemented activities. The DCNR service foresters can recommend practice certification. And then forestry professionals, different from an NRCS forester or DCNR service forester. Those folks are typically technical service providers. They conduct the forest inventory, recommend treatment alternatives in a forest management plan that eventually the conservation planner utilized to build into a conservation plan. And then forestry contractors, those folks are implementing the forestry treatments recommended in the plans. So in Pennsylvania, we have also developed a guide to forestry roles and responsibilities that can kind of help you figure out what your role is in the process of helping a landowner with technical assistance. And all this is on the forestry page for NRCS Pennsylvania. There's a link to this document there. And this is all tiered to the 2018 Memorandum of Agreement that NRCS Pennsylvania has with Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. So this helps to guide the work of all the folks that are involved in forestry conservation in Pennsylvania. So this is part of understanding who your partners are, who's there to help you, and who you can call upon to provide better assistance to landowners seeking that assistance. And I guess that's my closing slide, and that's a fire. A really quiet understory fire, and it's doing a lot of good and very little harm in that forested setting. Really taking away some of the duff layer, taking away some of the invasive species that are found in the understory, and providing a seed bed basically for regeneration to occur. So I realize now that, Tim, I forgot to have you launch our
that's no problem.
question.
I'll put it in the chat right now. If you folks want to go to the chat, there's a link in there for an MS Forms question. Go ahead and put your name in there and then select your answer, and that will document your participation here. And we can give folks just a couple moments to do that. And in the meantime, are there any questions for Peter? Peter, thanks so much for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll scroll back in the chat here to see if I missed anything.
I think it was mostly comments. So when I tried this, I maybe my MS Forms won't work for those that don't have an account. I thought I would be good there. Well, The question is, so I'm getting some responses, but the question is, due to past management activities, PS forests are mostly considered A, uneven aged, B, even aged, C, multilateral, or D, hickory. So if you don't have an MS Forms account, if you don't have a Microsoft account, then you can just type your answer in the chat. And Peter, if you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen so people can see.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Just a basic question to make sure that we're paying attention. Excellent.
And the question is right down here at number 2. Hopefully everyone can see, and we can see some results coming in while we're talking here. And Peter, anything you want to say? I might as well go ahead and just give the answer if you want.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks are saying it. Yeah, it's an even-aged forest, and that's what we're dealing with a lot within Pennsylvania. So thanks for recognizing that, and I think that is a problem, but it also presents a huge opportunity for conservation. And if we can understand what's going on with our forests, that helps conservation planners to help relay the message. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Peter. And I'm sure you wouldn't mind if people reach out as they come across forestry.
I realize on my closing slide that is an incorrect email address. Now that's an old one. That pa.usda, it's only usda.gov now. So you guys probably understand that. But yeah, please reach out if you have any questions. I'm always happy to help.
Excellent, thank you. So with that, we're going to transition to our next presentation. Do we have Yuri Plowden on the call? Yuri, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Yuri. Hey, thanks. So Yuri is our state soil scientist. She's been serving in that role for a couple of years now, and we're excited to have Yuri talk about some basic soils properties today. And Yuri, you know, we're running a little bit behind, but take your time. I told people we're sticking to the agenda loosely, and if we get out of here by lunchtime, that's the goal. So I think you got plenty of time. So with that, if you want to share your presentation, Yuri, it's all yours.
Okay, I will do so.
And then you have a couple of questions that I have, and learned the hard way here just now that not everyone has a Microsoft account to get in. So those that do can answer questions in the forums, and those that don't, we'll just have to use the chat.
That's fine. And I'll get you all out of here before noon. So no worries. So yeah, I'm Yuri Plowden, state soil scientist based out of Harrisburg. And this presentation is going to be kind of a condensed soils 101. And but mostly I'll just be talking about basic soil properties and mostly the physical properties. What soil is composed of, texture, structure, color, horizons, drainage class, and depth class. And these are all things that as conservation planners, you will start to become very familiar with, and you'll hear these terms a lot. Particularly, as you may know, we are focusing a lot on soil health these days. So these are all terms that are part of the soil health lexicon of terminology. So just, let's see, I'm kind of curious. Those of you, I'm assuming a lot of you are soil cons or maybe soil con techs. And some of these positions, it's required to have soils courses to have them, but others may not. So maybe just, can you raise your hand to let me know if you have had a soils course? And let me see if I can actually see that. Or maybe just type in the chat, like, yes, you've had soils. So I just kind of get a feel for my audience. All right, I'm seeing some yes, many no. Okay, some people say no. That's good to know. And so, okay.
20 hands raised, Yuri.
20 hands raised. Okay. All right. And there are some no's. All right. So this will be a review for those of you that have had soils, and maybe some new information for those who never have. Okay. So let's launch into this. Okay, how do I, oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So just, soil basics. It's a mixture of minerals, organic matter, water, and air. Can support the growth of plants. It has microorganisms. There are many different types. And as you probably know instinctively, this is right out of the Soil Science Society of America, soils are critical to life on this planet. It grows our food, again, habitat for soil organisms. Water that we drink is filtered by soil, that recycles nutrients, and it's the foundation on which we live and build and transport ourselves on. And what I like to tell middle schoolers when I do middle school soils outreach, if it weren't for soils and the soil organisms that are in there, we'd be drowning in our own garbage, because it's soil organisms that decompose things. All right, so here's getting into some science. Soil forming factors. So there are 5 different soil forming factors that combined to form many, many different kinds of soils. And at one time I knew how many different soil series were mapped in Pennsylvania. There are maybe there are several hundred, like maybe 600, 700 different soil types series mapped in Pennsylvania. Can anybody tell me in the chat, what does any of these soils as a function of CLORPT? What are any of those stand for? CLORT. You can say in the chat. I don't see any. Okay, there we go. Time, topography. All right. Okay, Stephanie says climate, organisms, parent material, time. She got it. All right, yep, CL is climate. That's from, this was Factors of Soil Formation, was defined back in 1941. So those of you that answered in the chat, you were correct. You have climate, organisms, relief or landscapes. I usually say topography, and parent material. What was it formed what was it formed from? And these interact together over time. So you have, if you have young soils, and you can have very old soils. So delving into these factors. So in general, with climate, soils develop faster in warm, wetter climates and slower in colder, arid ones. So our soils here in the temperate east are typically, we consider them older and more highly weathered, particularly in like our limestone valleys. If you work in the Ridgeon Valley, Ed Shokus, who's the soils professor at Penn State, he estimates, he had a paper that our limestone soils could be anywhere from 11 million to 30 million years old, depending on what you use as the rate of dissolution of limestone. And contrast that to out in the arid West, those soils are considered younger because without as much water and colder climates, they just don't develop as quickly. Organisms, so plant roots, animal burrows, all these things break down the soil. And in organisms, you will have different kinds of soils forming depending on what your plant community is above. So for example, our prairie soils, our mollisols out in the Midwest, have a very thick, dark A horizon that's full of organic matter from those prairie grasses growing and putting carbon down into the soil. And our forest soils here, let's say in the temperate east, you'll have a very thin A horizon, and then you'll have a layer of just like organic matter, leaf litter up on top of that. So moving on to two of our three other soil forming factors, parent material is the stuff that soil forms from. It might be bedrock, or it could be alluvium from river riparian areas. It could be glacial till, or it could even be windblown materials that have been deposited. Topography is where you are on the landscape and the shape of that landscape. So you tend to find your deeper soils at the bottom of the hills because that's where gravity has worked to take material that was above it and deposit it down at the base of the slope. And then you'll have shallower soils up towards the top, the ridge tops. And then again, time, all these factors work together to see how much soil development you have, depending on how long that soil has been sitting there developing from that parent material. So here's another look at parent material in Pennsylvania. These are physiographic provinces. So each of these colored areas represents kind of a different geology and combination of geology and climate and other factors. And this is the central area. The Appalachian Mountain section is also called the Ridgeon Valley, and that's the area I'm most familiar with. If you're in southeast Pennsylvania, you'll be working in the Piedmont uplands and maybe the Great Valley, which is a big limestone valley. If you're in either of the northern corners of the state, the northeast or the northwest, you'll be in glacial till. And those soils are very interesting and have their own sets of problems. And then the other areas of the state, you'll be in the Appalachian Plateau, where the bedrock is flat-lying, and so the soils have formed from flat-lying bedrock versus this Appalachian Mountain section, the Ridgeon Valley, where the bedrock is tilted. And here's another look at the glacial areas of Pennsylvania. And these maps are available from DCNR. They're really great. So a little bit more about the landscape position or topography as a soil forming factor. So what this slide shows you is in the upland areas, and let's say this is all controlled by bedrock. There's bedrock underlying all this. You will get a better where it's flatter and you've had water and freeze thaw working on a stable upland landscape. You'll have a more well-developed soil, meaning you'll have more you'll have soil horizons. The development will go deeper before you get to the R, which is the bedrock, and I'll go over the soil horizons in a couple more slides a little bit later. Down in your floodplain, this is where we call the young soils, because this recent alluvium, this may have been deposited, let's say, in the last several hundred years. And in geologic time, that's considered pretty young. And so you won't have a whole lot of soil development. You might have a topsoil A horizon, and then you'll just have like sandy, gravelly alluvium doesn't have much soil development in it. And then at the base of the slope, or maybe in an old alluvial terrace that has since now become upland, you'll have sort of an intermediate level of soil development, because that's it's not a real old landscape. It's relatively new material compared to what's in the upland, but it's older, been sitting older in place with soil forming factors working on it than the recent alluvium below. Another aspect of relief is the shape. And as soil conservationists, this is very, very important, because you want to know how water is moving on the landscape. Because why? Because water carries soil particles with it, and it also has to do with the depth of your soil and maybe the depth of your high water table. So, in the two slopes on the left, the first one is, we consider it divergent. This is a convex landscape where water is flowing off of it. And on convex landscapes, think of an upside down bowl. These tend to will be shallower. You'll have bedrock closer to the surface in general. And then convergent, where you have it's concave and you have water moving into it, you have soil material moving into it, you start to get into slightly deeper, more weathered soils. And then here's on the right, this is a good block diagram that shows where runoff goes. If you have a concave landscape, you'll have the concentrated flow towards the middle, and you may even have ponding or a higher water table where the slope flattens out at the bottom and all the water accumulates. And this also talks about the water table. You may have water perching above a harder fragipan or bedrock layer, or you may have the water table throughout the profile. And that's the difference between an epiaquic water table and an endoaquic. Okay, so moving out of soil forming factors to the soils themselves. So this may be a familiar diagram to you, but we think of soils and we think it's all mineral, it's all dirt. Well, no, in a healthy agricultural soil, you will have only 45% of a soil clump that's the actual mineral, the actual dirt part. But fully 25% of that will be air, 25% will be water, and in a healthy system, maybe you'll have up to 5% or more of organic matter. So this is a typical average soil composition for a healthy ag soil. So soil organic matter, that part that only makes up the 5% or less, is critically important. It improves physical condition. It increases the water infiltration. Soil organic matter will improve your soil tilth. And what it does is you have your live fraction of your soil, your plant and animal residues, and the metabolizing of organic matter and the decomposition. Your bacteria and your macro microfauna basically exude, we call it glomalin. It's like a sticky glue, and that aggregates the soil particles together, and that improves. So instead of lots of individual fine soil particles, you'll get these aggregated clumps, and that improves infiltration, that improves your tilth, that improves aeration. So organic matter is critical, and you'll hear a lot about it in soil health as you progress in your career. It's the living portion, and it feeds the decomposed matter feeds all your soil biota, and it also, there's the dead part, and that's those are the dead decayed things that feed the living portion. So you may have organic soils, and these typically form in wet areas. The wetness and sometimes in cold areas also, the water inhibits the decomposition of your leaf litter and all your plant material, and so it accumulates. And in an organic soil, you might have peat, which it's very fibrous. It's the least decomposed. You might have mucky peat, where it's kind of it's semi-decomposed, or you have muck, sapric, where it's highly decomposed and it's all black and greasy and messy. We in Pennsylvania, we do have organic soils. They're called histosols, but and they'll be in the bogs, or they'll be in the very low-lying areas. But then also some of them have since been drained and converted to agriculture. So then you have most of our soils in Pennsylvania, and most of the soils that you will deal with are mineral soils. So these are primarily composed of sand, silt, and clay with varying amounts of organic matter. And texture. Soils have texture, and what that means is it's the relative composition of sand, silt, and clay particles. And so sand, you can see it with your naked eye. You know, you don't necessarily need a magnifying glass, and you can feel it. It's coarse and it's gritty. With silt, that's the stuff that if you wet up a clod of soil and you rub it in your hands, it feels very soft, almost like floury. And you can't really see an individual silt particle with the unaided eye. Maybe with a good magnifying glass you can. And then clay is very, very small. You can only see an individual clay particle with an electron microscope, and that's what makes the soil feel stiff and sticky. And so it's the relative percentages of sand, silt, and clay that determine how that soil will behave in terms of drainage, water holding capacity, erodibility, those sorts of things. So any of you that took a soils course in college, or maybe you did Envirothon, this should be very familiar. This is the soil textural triangle. And when we're out in the field, when soil scientists are out in the field and we're trying to determine the relative amount of sand, silt, and clay to tell what soil texture it is, this is what we use. And on the right axis, it goes from top to the bottom right is the percentage of silt going from 0 to 100%. On the bottom axis, going from right to left, we're going from 0 up to 100% sand. And on the left side of the triangle is the percent clay, where the bottom left is 0% clay and up to the apex of the triangle is 100% clay. And so where you are on that triangle, if you've got more clay, you're going to be at the top of the triangle. If you're more silty, you're going to be on the right side of the triangle. If you're more sandy, you're going to be on the left hand side of the triangle. And then your loams are where the sand, silt, and clay kind of have an equal influence, and we call that a loam. And then these are the different soil texture terminology: loamy sand, sandy loam, fine sandy loam, on and on and on. In Pennsylvania, we have a lot of silt loam. Most of the topsoil in Pennsylvania is going to be silt loam for the most part. And one way that we determine soil texture of a soil is you can put a glop of soil in a jar with water, shake it up, and the sand will settle out first, and then the silt, and then the clay will stay in suspension for a long time. And that's one way. That there is a laboratory method that basically uses this and uses the relative rate of settling of the different particles to determine soil texture. So why do we care about texture? Well, the amount of pore space is determined by the texture of the soil. So on the left, we have a coarse textured soil. Let's say a very sandy soil. You have big soil aggregates. So overall, compared to the right hand side, where you have a fine textured, maybe a clayey, silty soil, the soil on the right, even though the pore space is much smaller, you actually have more total pore space than the coarse textured soil on the left. However, in a very fine textured soil, even with more total pore space, this water, if you have water and air in this soil, it may be less available to your plant roots than when you have larger aggregates. So that's illustrated in this graph, where this is the plant available water. So your left-hand side is inches of water per foot of soil. So if you were to take that a foot of soil and squeeze all the water out of it, this is the inches of water that would come out in a beaker. And then these are your different soil textures on your bottom x-axis. The curve on the top is the field capacity. So field capacity is when you have a rain situation and the soil becomes saturated, and then then you have free flow of water, it drains, and then what's left is called field capacity. And then the bottom curve is the wilting point. And that's where you may still have water in the soil profile, but it is so tightly held that plants can't get to it, so they start to wilt. So the difference between the wilting point and the field capacity is the available water. And so the size of this lens here will tell you what the relative plant available water is depending on the texture of your soil. Okay, so sand, the lens is very narrow. So you have sandy soils and you don't have as much available water, but the water that's there probably is pretty easily available. And then on the opposite extreme, you have clay, and you notice that the wilting point curve is pretty high. So there's quite a bit of water still in clay when your plants are at wilting point, but the lens is still narrow in clay too. So also the water, you have more water, but there's not as much available. So where's your most available water? That's right in the middle here where the lens is the thickest, and that's your silt loam. Your silt loam, your loams, your sandy loams. So the soil texture has a big effect on available water. Okay, so moving on to soil structure. Soil structure is the arrangement of soil particles into small clumps called PEDs. And soil structure, as well as texture, will affect how the soil will hold water and nutrients. So these are the common types of soil structure you'll see. So this upper one, granular, this is what you'll typically see in your A horizon, in your surface horizon, particularly if you have good soil health. Because what you've got here is you've got the organic matter, and you have exudates from plant roots and the metabolites from your soil microfauna and microbiology that are aggregating individual soil particles together to build a granular structure. Water and air can move very well through granular structure. Platy structure is another thing you'll see in Pennsylvania if you dig a pit. This tends to be where you have soil compaction. So maybe you had granular structure at one time, and then the farmer drove on it, or during when it was wet, and it just smushed it into plates. And you can imagine water doesn't move very well vertically through this platy structure. Prismatic structure is something that you'll see in what we call fragipan. A fragipan is a subsoil layer that's dense and tends to be brittle and hard, and water doesn't move through it very well. And then columnar structure is something you won't see in Pennsylvania. This is more in saline soils out in the west. You'll see blocky structure. So think of your granular structure that's in much bigger blocks. That's blocky structure. Single grain is where you'll have like sand, pure sand, and massive is if you dig down deep enough and basically your slightly weathered bedrock, or maybe you'll have a huge accumulation of clay, and you try and break, you take a clump of that and you try and hold it in your hand and break it up, and it doesn't fall into any kind of individual PEDs. That's called massive. So we really want to maintain good soil structure. So remember that granular structure I told you about. Granular, loamy textured soils, they make the best farmland. Now you can't, it's like what kind of hand were you dealt in poker? A farmer is dealt a certain kind of soil. As far as texture goes, he can't really change the amount of sand, silt, and clay. but he can maintain good soil structure and granular soil structure with that organic matter. And by reducing heavy traffic so that you don't get compaction and making sure that there's a living plant root growing in that soil as much as possible. All right, our next physical property is color, and I love soil color. There was maybe about 15 years ago, we came out with a NRCS Soils calendar that was all about soil color. So that can tell us something about the soils, particularly how much organic matter it has, because of course the more organic matter is dark brown or black, so you'll get dark topsoil because of the organic matter. And our soils are colored that orange, brown, yellowish brown because of the iron in the minerals. So why is that important? Because a soil that is poorly drained will develop, chemical changes will happen to the iron minerals in that soil. And I'll show you a chart of that in the next couple slides that will change the color of the mineral pigment, so that this soil clod on the left has mottles of gray and yellow. This is a sign of a fluctuating high water table. This is a sign that this soil spends a portion of the year very wet, and then maybe the water table fluctuates up and down. And a well-drained soil will be mostly brown and red or yellow. So the soil color depends on the oxidation state of iron. So again, why is this important? Because a well-aerated, a well-drained soil, your iron will be in an oxidized form, and that's for your chemistry, it'll be a ferric ion, and it'll be with a 3 positive charge, and these will be your bright yellows and browns, and these are typically in well-drained situations. However, where you have poor aeration or anaerobic conditions where you lack oxygen, the iron becomes reduced, becomes chemically reduced, and it turns into the ferrous ion, and it goes into solution. So it actually dissolves, and you get dissolved iron ferrous molecules in solution. And what happens is the soil particles themselves become dull and gray and blue because you've lost the iron rust-colored minerals. The iron has dissolved away, and that's an indication of a poorly drained soil. So when you're walking on your farm, here on the left, in the middle of the field in the upland, your soils may look like this first column. They'll be bright brown, and you'll have a good topsoil, and this is a well-drained soil. But if you go down into your ditch or into your low-lying area where water accumulates, the same kind of soils maybe will look like this. They'll be poorly drained, in that maybe they were made originally from the same parent material, but because of water, they change colors. This is now a different color. It's this dark black, gray, and mottled color. Okay, and I see a question. How can you distinguish if the oxidation state is due to underlying wetland conditions or management choices that lead to poor drainage? That's a very good question. So a wet soil, a hydric soil, once it's hydric, it will stay hydric. And so it could become hydric either because of the natural landscape position that accumulates water, or it could be because of management choices where something changed on the way the land was managed, and that area now gets a lot more water. And soils can develop these reduced conditions, these hydric looking conditions in just a few years if the conditions are just right. So you have to look at your whole landscape and decide what is going on there. That's a good question, and we run into that a lot when we're doing wetland determinations. So soil color, we describe soils using the Munsell soil color chart. This is I'm not sure about the history of why we use Munsell soil colors, but basically it's a standardized way to describe soil color. So if I describe a soil, like in this case, it's a 7.5 YR, and let's say I have a 7.5 YR 6.1 soil would be in this chip here. Any soil scientist around the world will know then what the color of that soil is. It's a standardized way of describing soil color. Instead of just like, well, grayish brown or reddish brown, you can actually go to Munsell soil color and see what the color is. And we look at hue, value, and chroma. Let me go back to this page. So the hue is the redness or yellowness of the soil. And that tends to be in the Munsell soil color chart. That'll be in the upper right-hand corner of the page. The value is the going up and down the page. From the top is the lightest color to the bottom is the darkest color. And then the chroma is, we call it the brightness. So that's going from left to right. A low chroma soils will be dark or gray or not much color to them. And as you move to the right, they get brighter and brighter. So it's called hue, value, chroma. And we always write soil color in that order. We put the hue first, then the value, then the chroma. Okay, so then looking at soil horizons, soils, because of the weathering front of movement of water moving through soil profile and freeze thawing and the effect of weathering on the soil profile, soils tend to develop horizontal layers. We call them horizons. And these are the most common horizons that you'll see. The O horizon is an organic layer, and you won't necessarily find that in a farm soil, but in a relatively undisturbed forest soil, you will have an organic layer, a litter of leaves and lightly decomposed vegetation. Then you get your A horizon, and this is your first mineral layer, but it's dark colored because it is highly influenced by the organic matter. Then you get your subsoil, which is your B horizon, and then your C horizon can be a number of things. A lot of times it's lightly weathered bedrock. So it's not quite, it doesn't have a lot like good structure. Maybe it's massive, or it might be like a lens of sand or gravel or a massive layer that just doesn't have a whole lot of soil development. So here's a close-up of an O horizon. I think the O horizon is really this very thin top that's mostly the fibrous area. And then this darker stuff between 4 and 8 inches, I think that's probably the A horizon. But the O horizon can be very thin unless you're in an organic soil, like I showed you in that slide before, where you have a thick accumulation of organic matter. But typically our O horizons are very thin. The A horizon here is this first layer of darker mineral soil. And what I love about this picture is it shows this very clear demarcation between the A topsoil and the B horizon, the subsoil. And when you see that, that's called an AP horizon. P for, well, anthropogenic, but it means plowed. We call it a plow layer. And so you might even be in a forest and you'll dig down and you'll see this very clear AP horizon. And that's a clue that soil had been farmed at one point and now it had a forest growing on it. And if you have a farm that has been in a soil health practices like no-till and cover crops for several decades, this clear boundary will start to fade and it'll become wavy. You'll see the organic matter will start to dip into the B horizon through worm channels and root channels. But this is a typical farm soil where you have this very clear A horizon called an AP horizon. A less familiar horizon, one that you don't see as often because of disturbance and plowing, is an E horizon. And what that is, it's a zone of, we call it eluviation, where things have moved out of this. You have on the left-hand side, let's say you have your A horizon and your O horizon, and then the organic acids from the decomposing plant material have moved down through the soil profile and combined with the iron and clay and then moved it further down, and so it accumulates down below in this more concentrated area of color. And so this E is kind of a leached layer, and in a very well developed, usually slightly sandy forest soil, you'll get this very clear almost white, we call it an albic horizon. The middle one, it shows a more subtle E horizon, but you can tell that it is lighter and more leached than the A horizon above it and the B horizon below it. And this one on the right, it's pretty hard to see, but you can see just below this darker surface horizon, this area of lighter material, and then it gets darker. Those are an E horizon where you've lost clay, you've lost iron, you've lost aluminum, and it's been deposited below. Then we get to our subsoil, our B horizon, and we call that, the B horizon is a zone of accumulation. It could be clay, it could be aluminum. In arid, more arid climates, it could be calcium carbonates or salts. It forms below the O, the A, or the E horizon. And basically, often in Pennsylvania soils, these will be heavier in clay, because what has happened is any clay that was weathered out of the upper horizons has moved down and accumulated in the B horizon. So you'll sometimes see this bulge of clay, and you can feel it when you dig down. Suddenly it gets heavy down there. And I believe this soil on the right, I'm not sure, I think these are calcium carbonate inclusions, these sort of whiter areas, and that's in a more arid soil, you'll get calcium carbonates accumulating. Then, as I mentioned before, the C horizon is kind of in between. It could be lightly weathered bedrock, or in this case, this looks like maybe a sandy floodplain soil, where this is a young soil. You just don't have much soil development. You've got your A horizon up here, maybe a thin B horizon, and then the C material down here, which might just be alluvium that has not had much soil forming factors working on it yet, because it's very young. And here on the right, this looks like an interesting, probably a floodplain. Maybe it's a lake soil where you have these thin layers of deposition, and then you have a buried A down here. So you had new soil material forming on top of old soil material, and it's mostly C. We call it C horizon because there's just not that much soil development in it. It doesn't have much structure. It's massive. So now that we've talked about horizons, the two other physical properties I want to talk about are drainage class and depth of restrictive zone. So drainage class, of course, is very important, because if we have wetlands, we want to know where the high water table is. We want to know if we're in a wetland or not. The frequency and duration of wetness under which soils formed will be the drainage class, and we usually determine that by the depth to the gray and orange modeling. We call that gray and orange modeling redoxomorphic features. That's the fancy name for models. So this is a chart that maybe you want to print out and put on your desk, because in Pennsylvania, or if you look at Web Soil Survey or you look at the soil description, the drainage class will be described as excessively drained, somewhat excessively drained, well drained, mildly well drained. Sometimes, I think in Web Soil Survey, it may tell you the depth to the water table, but these are the depths that we go by in Pennsylvania. So if the water table is greater than 60 inches, we call that very well drained, maybe even excessively well drained. 40 inches is kind of our mark for well-drained soil, because that's below most of the rooting zones of plants. And then you have moderate well-drained, somewhat poorly drained, and poorly drained. So poorly drained soils and very poorly drained is when that water table, seasonal high water table, is very, very close to the surface. And this just shows what the implications of drainage class. So when you have a poorly drained soil on the right, you're not going to have, your roots aren't going to go very deep. They're going to stay close to the surface, and you'll have that modeling very close to the surface, maybe within 6 inches. And then as you increase your drainage and you get better and better drained, you can see the roots will grow longer, and that depth to that model layer gets deeper and deeper. Another thing that you'll see in a soil description is the depth to the restrictive layer. That could be bedrock, like on the right. So if this measuring tape is in feet, then you have your restrictive layer at about 1.5 feet. That's where you start to get bedrock. That doesn't give your plants a whole lot of growing room, but you know it's better than nothing. And then on the left is a very deep soil where you don't get to, I think these are these might be rotten rock, but you don't really see bedrock in this profile at all, and it's already at 68 inches. So this is a very deep soil on the left. And so here's another good chart maybe to have nearby so that when you're reading your soil descriptions, you'll know what it means, that a soil that's classified as very shallow means you've got bedrock within 10 inches. And if a very deep soil means you typically don't hit bedrock till about 60 inches. And then there's everything in between. It's good chart to have. So that concludes my my basic soil property talk. And I do believe that we have a quiz.
Yeah.
Let's see, I could, you know what, because the poll didn't work.
Actually, I changed the setting, Yuri, so I think it should be working now.
Oh, good. Okay, well, let's give it a try.
So here's the first question in the chat, and let me know if you are unable to access that. Those that had trouble before, I'm hoping that by changing a setting, you will now be able to get into it.
I'm trying to. Let's see. Okay. True or false? The average ag topsoil is composed of 90% mineral, 5% organic matter, and 5% water. Is that true or false?
And I can share my screen, Yuri.
Yeah, why don't you share your screen? Yep.
Can you see, they're loading right now, the responses. There we go. Can you see that?
I can.
So we've got 26 false and 5 true.
Okay.
31 false.
We've got like 45 students, so we've got
41 responses so far. Ooh. So you can go ahead and share your whatever you'd like to say.
Right. So the answer is false. If you recall, the average composition of a healthy ag soil is 45% mineral, 5% organic matter, 25% air, and 25% water.
Excellent. All right, let's go to our question number 2. I'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah, okay. What is soil structure? So what is soil structure? Is it A, the relative percent of sand, silt, clay, B, the depth to the restrictive layer, C, the relative amount of organic matter, or D, the arrangement of soil particles into small clumps called PEDs? This is fun, just kind of seeing the responses roll in.
Yeah.
You'll have to show me how you change the settings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting.
We've got 34 responses so far. They're coming in.
Okay, so these are these color coded? So if it's
yes, so D is red, and those that answered A would be blue. So we've got 9 A's and 34 D's.
Okay, well, this is telling. Okay, so the correct answer is D. Soil structure is the arrangement of soil particles into small clumps called PEDs. So those that answered A, the relative percentage of sand, silt, and clay, what does anybody know what that is? It's not soil structure. If we're talking about the relative percentage of sand, silt, and clay, what is that? You can say in the chat. Okay, soil texture, yes, excellent. Yeah, so when we're talking sand, silt, and clay, we're talking texture. When we're talking about the arrangement of soil particles into clumps like granular, blocky, prismatic, that's soil, and platy, that's soil structure. Important to know as we move forward with soil health. Okay, so then the third one,
The link is
Which-
in the chat.
There it is. Okay. Which horizon is considered the zone of accumulation of clay, iron, aluminum, calcium carbonate, salts, etc.? And it's, there's the letter that you answer versus the horizon letter. So try not to confuse the two.
I apologize. That's my fault. I should have made them the same.
No, I should have actually. Okay. Okay, this could be tricky. So the answer is A, E, C, or okay, no. Oh, you guys are right. All right. Oh, that's good, Tim. So B is red.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. So that is correct. So the correct answer is the B horizon. That's the subsoil, and that tends to be where things accumulate, the clay, iron, and so forth, and so on. All right.
Excellent.
So you guys were paying attention, and or you remembered your basic soils 101. Well, if you have any questions, and tomorrow we'll dive into how you as conservation planners, how you will know what soils are on the farms you're working on, and how to read the soil survey. It's pretty straightforward, but I'm surprised sometimes how people don't always understand how to read the soil survey, and so we'll also talk a little bit about ecological site descriptions tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Yuri. I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, wait. Yeah, there is. Yuri, I have seen tons of soils presentations, and yours is one of the best. So kudos to Yuri.
Well, great. Thanks. It was actually a joint effort because, several people have developed this presentation over the years. So, but thank you.
And Brandy, you can look forward to hearing more from Yuri tomorrow. We are going to have a couple of our presenters back tomorrow. And we're going to have a couple new ones as well. So with that, that'll conclude today's meeting. It'll be the same link for tomorrow. We'll start at 8 o'clock again. And I certainly would recommend getting in a couple minutes early, but we'll have a very similar day tomorrow with different topics and presentations. So thank you very much. I appreciate all the interaction. That was excellent. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good lunch.